All right, I am now joined by C. Derrick Varn of Zero Books and now the Varn Vlog on YouTube. And we've been talking about doing this for a while, but this seemed like a good time since the last two of the debate breakdowns that we did, since I was kind of double dipping and using them as homework, were of debates involving Charlie Kirk, and like that seems like it's let's class it up a little bit and do Dugin, Henry Lévy. Although I don't actually, my general impressions of these guys are basically, you could fill in probably a lot more details about both of our debaters here than I can, but like basically my general impressions of these guys are that like Dugin's kind of a creepy reactionary, and Henry Lévy is like a NATO-loving neoliberal windbag who's like kind of deeply unappetizing in lots of ways. So maybe it's a little bit of an alien versus predator situation, but you can give much less superficial accounts of who these people are.
Yeah, so Dugin is a complicated figure, even complicated in the Russian context. He was a Soviet dissident in the 80s, was part of the early foundations of the National Bolsheviks and the National Bolshevik Front in the 90s. Distanced himself from that as he became increasingly involved in the Orthodox Church, started picking up 16th through 19th century political theory, trying to resurrect Eurasian thought, Trilarchy versus Talasarchy, which I'm not sure I'm pronouncing, but that is the idea of water and air powers versus land powers, and the differences in culture it produces. He started in the late 90s, incorporating more and more French postmodern thought into his way of thinking. So you started seeing him citing, he always cited Heidegger and Schmitt and the people you'd expect, reactionary non-liberals to cite. But he also started citing more Guy Debord, which comes up in the debate. He started citing Derrida. He started citing Foucauldian interpretations of Heidegger. In some ways, he is, the most extreme form of what someone like Matt McManus would call postmodern conservatism. Mm-hmm. But even that's a little misleading, because there are some things about his thought that are unique to the Russian context. And he was important in United Russia. The Eurasian Party had kind of been reconciled with United Russia. He was actually, after his criticisms of Putin for not being radical enough in the Ukraine, he lost his position at Moscow University. And now he's sort of a...
So he just wanted Putin to just like annex much more of the Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, he even says it in the debate. Like he wanted the entirety of the eastern Ukraine to be annexed, and western Ukraine to be independent, and as a gateway to Europe. There's also times where he pushed for the Ukraine and to be split between Poland and Russia. But, NATO wasn't particularly interested in that. I think a lot of people underestimate him when they go to engage with him, because they think of him as a joke, particularly in America, because I think a lot of Americans first learned of him, honestly, from Alex Jones, mm-hmm. when he appeared on the Alex Jones show and sounded like a raving loony. That's in the context of him losing power in Russia. Recently, he's been kind of recuperated by the Russian nationalist media sphere. So like he basically has like a high, like the high arch pundit of Russian news channel actually. What's interesting about that is that would be like if one of our conservative philosophers, which there aren't that many of, had that at Fox News. So it's he's an interesting guy. I've had run-ins with him, or not him personally, but people around his fourth position internationalist theory in South Korea. In fact, I knew an American who worked with him at University of Moscow, and he was trying to get Marxists to fight against liberalism, and in the real like true Red Brown Alliance way. But it's interesting because he was discovered in America, I think, after Trump, and he was kind of used as a boogeyman figure. And what was ironic about that is by that time he'd actually lost, and particularly in that period he'd lost a lot of power in Russia. And you started seeing him pushing out to meet with the European right a lot more, and doing more international forays, because he does, as you can tell from the debate, he actually speaks quite good English. And he can be formidable. But let's see, let's get to Bernard-Henri Lévy. He's one of the new philosophers. They were they are almost neoconservative, so they're not seen that way in the French context, because they do tend to be anti-war, which breaks them with the neoconservatives here. But during the 70s, particularly after the Gulag Archipelago was written, they were a group of philosophers around Sartre that turned and started embracing civil rights discourse, non-Marxist socialism, are just outright liberalism, and Henri Lévy's in kind of in the middle of that. His claim to fame in the United States is the Empire and the Five Kings, the Genius of Judaism, because he's a Sephardic Jew, and it's a big part of his philosophy. And let's see, what else is he kind of big here for? That's really kind of it. For debates he had actually with Michel Houellebecq, the poet and novelist who is often cited as reactionary. So I think a book that you can learn a little bit about him in English, but it's frustrating in the way this debate was frustrating actually, is Public Enemies, which is the letters between Houellebecq and Henri Lévy, debating like the fate of France and the fate of center right, center left.
What's Houellebecq's position? I mean, I like read one of his novels, but I don't know anything else.
That France is more or less doomed. That the coalitions of different groups in France, from conservative Catholics to Muslim refugees, make the kind of secular culture impossible to maintain, and different kind of coalitions are going to break it apart. Houellebecq is, from what I can tell, not actually a supporter of the National Front, but he seems to think that it's almost inevitable that they come to power. And Henri Lévy is basically defending the left wing of the Macron position. So he is sort of like a crown prince philosopher of the EU. So sometimes in the U.S. will posit him as a leftist, which confuses me, because in the French context, he's definitely a clear centrist, maybe left of center, maybe like a I don't know, what would be a philosopher in America of Clintonism, like Richard Rorty or something, maybe that. But he's not that sophisticated in what I've read. So I mean, just like some of the positions that I know he's taken, he really wanted more intervention in Bosnia. He really wanted more intervention in Syria in like 2013. He seems to be a fan of
veil bans, which of course reads as hard right in the U.S., but is like a shitty position that centrists take in countries like France and Germany, and he generally seems like somebody who's a a fan of. I'm just reading here at the opening of the Democracy and Its Challenges conference in Tel Aviv, May 2010. Lévy gave a very high estimation of the Israel Defense Forces, saying, quote, "I have never seen such a democratic army which asks itself so many moral questions." Which, got to big fan of asking yourself moral questions, in between bulldozing houses. That's good stuff. But on Dugin, one of the reasons I actually thought it might be interesting to watch him is that, I know you've talked about this on This Is Revolution, which is, also what I was curious about, your thoughts about this, because in the United States, I'll sometimes hear people who seem to believe that there's this contingent of, they'll call them Nazbols, people who are like, it's like literally like the joke from The Simpsons, the movie they're watching with Rainier Wolfcastle, the commie Nazis, this is like a real group of people. Mm-hmm. And I always kind of roll my eyes like, okay, this is ridiculous. Like, there are lots of, look, America's full of like creepy racist reactionaries, but like there are like 10 Nazis and they, people who are trying to combine that in some eccentric way with Bolshevism has got to be a smaller number. But in Russia, as you said, Dugin was actually involved in something that called itself the National Bolshevik group. So how real is Nazbolism in the Russian context?
Pretty real. I would say that, particularly in the 90s, it was a more real threat than it probably is now, but it's been recuperated in part into the right wing, the non-Atlanticist position in United Russia. One of the things about Russian politics is basically the debates aren't between, yes, there are dissidents that we hear about in the West, but the debates are really more between factions of United Russia. Mm. So there's a Eurasianist faction, there's a kind of Putinist faction, which is more clearly just Putin's center. And there's an Atlanticist faction, which people like Medvedev, people may remember him from about a decade ago when Putin reset himself by becoming prime minister instead of president, and let the Atlanticist faction actually step up to power. And basically, Putin balances those factions within United Russia. There's also Eurasianist Party, which is separate from United Russia, but kind of allied. The context for that also is like, if you go to St. Petersburg today, you will probably actually encounter commie Nazis. It's a real thing. It's a real street movement. One of the things that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union was a turn against internationalism, and more in Russia than and maybe a little bit in the closer to Russia parts of the Warsaw Pact than in the rest of the Warsaw Pact. So like Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, yes, they have their nationalists, but they tend to be a little bit more secular. Whereas what you saw in Russia was a resurgence of the Orthodox Church as one of the only surviving institutions from the pre-Soviet times become very politically important. So much so that right now, this is also not picked up by non-Orthodox Christians in America, but like the Orthodox world's in schism because of Ukraine and because of the Moscow Patriarchy actually more or less breaking with the Ecumenical Patriarch in Istanbul. So it's kind of its own thing. It has effects in America too, because there's a reason why specifically Russian Orthodoxy is often where you find people converting to Christianity who also have right nationalist ideas. It's technically, even in Russian Orthodoxy, heretical to believe in racial nationalism, but it's tied to this Russian phenomenon kind of explicitly, particularly around what was formerly known as Rokor, which was the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which was the kind of patriarchate that was not part of the Soviet recuperated hierarchy. And Dugin's actually kind of important to some of those guys here. But I would say that Red Brownism is very rare here. Like there is one of the far right groups that explicitly expresses Duginist philosophy. That's I think it's American Fourth Position. They used to be American National Front. They're a tiny group. I would not be surprised if there are like 30 people in the entire United States. However, what they did do a lot in the early aught teens was appeal to people who had anti-revisionist ideologies in the U.S., which for example, somewhat controversially, the sort of anti-imperialist Caleb Maupin was caught discoursing with Dugin, and actually, we were mutually friends on Facebook for a little while, and I actually knew some of the figures in his orbit, and I'm like, those people are Russian right-wingers. And when he had his falling out with the Workers' World Party, partially over this, it didn't surprise me. So it's not that it doesn't have some effect, but I would say it's extremely marginal. And to be charitable to Maupin, actually, it's not clear that he's actually a Duginist. He was just willing to
go to the conference or whatever.
Go to the conference, and he was in dialogue with them for some time before that conference. And Dugin is interested in left anti-imperialism to break up what he sees as Atlanticist, Anglo-Saxon predominance, cultural predominance, imperialism, etc.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. So I will say, because Caleb Maupin has a weird obsession with me. For the record, nobody here said he was a Nazi. I don't want
Nobody said he was a Nazi. Nobody said he was a fourth positionist. He just was his one of the reasons for the break with the WWP does seem to be his attending a conference with Dugin. And I can tell you, because of my own connections, that he was in dialogue with them earlier than that. But I can't tell you what it meant or if he actually held their ideology at all.
Sure.
Factual there.
So
how influential is Aleksandr Dugin? It's hard to say. I mean, there are rumors that he met with Bannon in 2016. He has had a long-running dialogue with the French group Greca, with Alain de Benoit. People forgive me, I can pronounce like 3 French names correctly. But the European New Right theorist who wrote things like on being pagan, against democracy, against meritocracy, stuff like that. Dugin's work in America has largely been translated by Arcos House, which is also associated with the European New Right and publishing people around, people like Richard Spencer. Like Arcos House is a very marginal press, but that's where it's been published. They also publish things like the political works of Julius Evola. So if people know the far right sphere, this is on the weirder end of it. And I think that's also why people don't know Dugin that well here. And when they do, like, I found 3 books in English and on Dugin, and only one of them's kind of good. Against the Modern World, I believe it's by Sedgwick, which is about the radical traditionalist movement in the late 90s, which led to the beginning. Like, it's part of the intellectual foundations of the alt-right. They're not all racialist, though. I mean, that's another thing that Dugin trips people up, because they expect him to espout racial ideology, and he actually really doesn't. He might be a Russian chauvinist. Mm-hmm. He seems to talk out of both ends of his mouth on that.
I mean, if he wants to annex all of the eastern Ukraine, that kind of sounds like it.
So, it's a very interesting sort of thing to come across here.
Yeah, so I mean, so there are. I mean, I know that figures like Dugin. I mean, somebody's kind of referred to this in the chat earlier. Like, it's sort of, people will, people will come across them, who know like three things from Wikipedia, and they're primarily interested in them as like a way of like telling some kind of story about Steve Bannon or whoever, that certainly is a thing, is a thing that'll happen, and honestly, I mean, I tend to think that like, in a way, like, all that stuff, in a weird way, all that stuff actually gives Bannon too much credit. I mean, I think he's basically just like a Republican with like slightly more racist than average views about immigration, but like basically he's just a Republican with like Prince of Darkness branded. But it seems like at the very least, as say, I mean, he was literally involved at one point with the National Bolshevik group in Russia, and his current views seem to be, at minimum, like, again, if he wants to annex all of Eastern Ukraine, like pretty hardcore Russian nationalist.
Yeah, he's so hardcore Russian nationalist and stuff like that he is seen as a problem for the Putin regime at this point. Like, even he criticized Putin explicitly in Russian. He published a book that was published, I think, actually is available in English if people want to read it. I wouldn't. I think it's interesting, called Putin versus Putin, where he really came out against him, and he did pay a political price for it, although he has not been silenced by the regime in any way, form, or fashion. But he did lose his fairly prestigious post at University of Moscow. So, I mean, in his own way, he was willing to go out on it. I actually found it interesting in the debate, when we talk about that, how he doesn't deny that at all. In fact, he owns it, to the point of like making Andre Levy look silly. Because the talking point is like, oh no, like the problem isn't that we took Crimea. The problem is we didn't take enough of Crimea because of this historical thing about the Ukraine, which you don't understand. And while there actually are there are counter narratives to what Dugin says about the Ukraine, but some of what he says is historically true. It is the Eastern Ukraine is the home of the Kievan Rus. It is where most Russians, the Muscovy Rus, trace their culture and their national, frankly, mythology. But it's also like modern Russia has way more to do with Muscovy and the Muscovy Principate. But when the history of Russia was codified at the in the 19th century, it was traced back to the Kievan Rus, who are culturally and religiously closer to Russians, whereas the Western Ukraine is a lot of what would be called unate Catholics, or former Orthodox who rejoined with the Catholic Church, and thus they're culturally more aligned with Poland. That's a true and fair issue and it's one that, frankly, NATO has never really addressed. Mm-hmm. So there is a real sense where he feels that way. But I mean, it seems like one of the things he got in trouble for and why he has sanctions on him in the United States, the sanctions on him were put on him in the United States and Canada in 2015, is because he was actively meeting with like rebel leaders in Donbass via Skype calls. So it's, it's not just that he supported it. He was like going out of his way to support separatist groups beyond the purview of the Russian government, which seemed to have even gotten him trouble in Russia itself. So it's a very interesting thing to deal with.
Fair enough. All right. Well, we should probably get started.
Mm-hmm.
"25 years ago, it was for self-evident that to remain true to the values of European humanism, a Nexus Institute had to be founded on the educational ideas of the novel in which had found its supreme expression, The Magic Mountain of Thomas Mann. Practice the art of conversations, listening to different, sometimes complete opposing views."
First of all, I always prefer
himself. That fortunately will not happen today. I double-checked. They don't have a gun. They even do not have a fake gun, which they will have here in Amsterdam. No fake guns. So, welcome everybody at today's Magic Mountain. And please do give a very warm welcome to Leonafta, also known as Aleksandr Dugin, and Ludovico Settembrini, also known as Bernard-Henri Lévy. Thank you.
So, first of all, I always prefer the battle of ideas to the physical war. And I am very, very happy that we could exchange with Mr. Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is famous on the world scale, not in the physical duel, because sometimes we are in the same front line, normally on different sides, in physical. So I prefer to speak, to exchange the idea here, not in the physical battle. Maybe it is the only way to avoid that, or at least to try. First of all, I would like to say that now President Macron recently has said that the hegemony of the West is over. The same thing about liberalism, or global liberalism, has said our president, Mr. Putin. There was recently the issue of foreign affairs with Fareed Zakaria article dedicated to the decline of Western power. And I think that it is something I'm going to discuss. In my eyes, it is almost obvious that there is such decline. In your book, Empire, Five Kings, you have noticed a very interesting thing, evaporizing of American presence in the Middle East in the case of Kurds. I think that we are approaching the end, not to the end of the history, as Mr. Fukuyama has said, but the end of political modernity. And that is the end of something very, very important that we should think, and that the end of Western hegemony, of American dominance, or globalism, global liberalism. It is something historical in itself, not technical. I interpret that as, for example, in Nietzsche words. So, in the beginning of the modernity, the humans have killed the god in order to liberate. But that was suicide. Killing the god, we have killed ourselves. And now, welcome to the last stage of nihilism. And it's interesting, in your book, you define, Mr. Lévy, American empire, or global liberal system, as the system of nihilism, based on nothing. It's a very interesting idea, and I would like to ask you why you still defend this more and more open nihilist system, why you fight for this declining modernity, and why you invest all your intellectual power in order to defend that.
Of course, I'm certainly not fighting for nihilism. I'm fighting, on the contrary, to combat nihilism. I'm fighting for political modernity because, in my words, it means democracy, freedom, equality between women and men, secularism, and so on. Political modernity, which is probably in crisis. I refuse the idea of its decline and of its disappearance because I strongly believe that it is a plus for the world. And about nihilism, I read you too since long. You are my adversary. We think oppositely on many fields, but I recognize your importance, especially on the Russian scene. And for me, that's why I read you carefully. For me, the embodiment of nihilism today is you and your friends and the Eurasian current and this morbid atmosphere which fills your books and the way in which you dissolve the very idea of human rights, of personal freedoms, of singularities in some big blocks of community, big faith, sacred origins, or so on. There is a perfume of nihilism that really embarrasses me when I read your Révolution conservatrice, your all your works about Eurasia since the beginning of the 90s.
So, but interesting. If you make a kind of identity between nihilism and refuse to the Western interpretation of human rights, freedom, and democracy, liberal democracy. So in that sense, I agree. I am against that because for me, it is not they are not universal values. First of all, I think that democracy, the content of democracy is changing. I have spoken once with Fukuyama, and Fukuyama defined the modern understanding of liberal democracy as the rule of the minorities against the majority, because majority can always transform into populism and fascism or communism. So that is completely new idea, I think. And I think that if I don't share this new understanding of liberal democracy, or if, for example, I challenge that the subject of the freedom should be individual, and that is the essence, the axis of human rights ideology, if I consider the identity of the man, of human culture, of society, not to be reducible to individuality. So, for example, in our Russian tradition, the subject of freedom or the subject, human subject, is not individual, it is collective. And that was in the time SARS, that was defined by church, after that by communism, but always collective identity was dominant in our culture, as well as in China, in its culture, in Indian culture, and up to the same level in the Islamic culture. But I think that I'm nihilist in the sense that I refuse universality of the modern Western value. I don't think they are universal. I think they are Western, they are modern. I think the West is very powerful still in order to defend them, but I just challenge that is the only way to interpret democracy as the rule of minorities against majority, the only way to interpret the freedom as individual freedom, the only way to interpret human rights, projecting Western modern individualistic version of human under other culture. That's my opinion.
You know your tradition, the Russian tradition, better than me, but I'm enough a friend of Russia to know that what you said about the pace of subjectivity in Russian tradition is not true. You have also a tradition of Herzen, of Pushkin, of Turgenev, a part of Sakharov, all the glorious tradition of the dissidents who fought the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, who fought in the name of individuality, rights of the subjects, and human rights. And this element, you cannot say that it is not part of the Russian tradition. And again, you know, I devoted such a big part of my life to defend Russia against slavery, totalitarianism, and so on, to be authorized to say that. Democracy, Fukuyama, I was not here during your debate with Fukuyama, but I suppose what I would say, at least myself, is that democracy is a complex concept and a complex process. It is the rule of the majority and the rule of the minority also, and the rule of parliament. It is a very complex architecture which involves, which knows evolutions throughout time, which enriches itself. And the difference between democracy and all sorts of authoritarianism, including the one of Putin in Russia today, is that democracy is always open, and always open to change, always open to progress, always open to enrichments, all withdrawals, all of that. And about nihilism, let's agree on one point. You speak of Nietzsche, who did not say that man killed the gods, by the way, but God, which is a very different thing. But the best definition of nihilism for me, we know it. We have it in our memory. Russia, with his 24 million of deaths during the Great Patriotic War. Us in Europe, occupied by the Nazism. The Jews, my people, nearly exterminated. There is one definition of nihilism, which is those who committed these crimes, which means the Nazis. And the Nazis means they did not come from the sky of Thule or of Tibet. They came from ideologists, from Carl Schmitt, from Spengler, from Stuart Chamberlain, from Karl Haushofer, all people which I'm sorry to know, to see that you like and you quote and you inspire yourself of their works. So for me, when I say that you are a nihilist, when I say that Putin is a nihilist, when I say that there is in Moscow a morbid atmosphere of nihilism, which creates, by the way, some real deaths, Anna Politkovskaya, Mr. Nemtsov, and so many others killed in Moscow or in London every day, I mean it. And I mean that, alas, for this great Russian civilization today, there is bad, dark wind of nihilism in its proper sense, which is a Nazi and the fascist sense, which is blowing on this great Russia. So
I guess one thought about this first part is that I have to admit that my listening to all this stuff about what is or isn't universal and who is or isn't nihilist, my inner analytic philosophy nerd is screaming, like, I don't know what any of this means. Tell me what it means. Like, it's just kind of driving me crazy that they're throwing this around as if it was like really clear. Like, okay, so does universal mean that it's objectively morally true? Does universal mean that that people in some culture happen to believe it, or most people in some culture happen to believe it? Does nihilism just mean like doing bad stuff? As far as I can tell, that's what Henri Lévy seems to mean.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we need to like take about style of debate here and the classical styles of debate. So there's analytic debate and there's dialectic debate. And dialectic here has very little connection to the way we use it in Marxism before people start freaking out. It just means you don't define your terms and let your terms emerge through the adversarial dialogue. It goes back to the Platonic dialogues, actually. That's what this debate is. The problem with dialectical debates is that they're easily rhetorically hacked. So you can just, what you can do, and one of the things that's frustrating that we see is a game of equivocation going on here. Dugin lays down a definition. Henri Lévy says no. The real version of that definition is when bad people do bad things. And you cited some of the bad people. Ipso facto, you are associated with the bad things. Now, from an analytic or even an informal logical standpoint, this is, it's a very elaborate way to just throw ad hominems at each other. And Henri Lévy does it more in this opening framework, but Dugin does it a little bit too. They both play with not defining nihilism, but saying nihilism is what the other side actually believes. Which, if you've read a lot of even neoconservative philosophy, so Stanley Rosen, the way that they'll employ nihilism, Stanley Rosen is a neoconservative Platonist philosopher, nihilism is basically what the other side believes because they obviously don't really have values, so I do. So you have well poisoning on both sides from the beginning. Well, what I will give Dugin credit for here is he does more or less frame the debate as a debate between the West claiming that its values are universal, whereas he is claiming that cultural values are particularistic and that you need to respect cultural values. Now, if Henri Lévy had read more of Dugin, he would know that doesn't mean for Dugin everything he's saying here. Like, Dugin is softening his position for his audience. But as far as framing the debate goes, like, Dugin's done it way more. Like, what he's arguing, even if he's playing this game with nihilism. Whereas with Henri Lévy, you feel like he's saying, okay, the Soviet Union was bad, Nazism was bad. The Soviet Union was good when it fought Nazis because the Great Patriotic War was good. But also gulags, bad. You're bad. I mean, that's more or less what Henri Lévy does here. And it's frustrating, right? Because you would like, what do you mean by democracy? And we'll see, Dugin actually does state a definition. His definition is what he interprets, and I need to go back and watch the Fukuyama Dugin debate. What he interprets Fukuyama saying about protecting, I'm assuming that Fukuyama and his stuff about social orders is saying that modern liberal democracy puts in place protections for minorities against the tyranny of the majority, going back to the Federalists. Now, originally, if we actually know the Federalists, the minority they were talking about was the rich. Right. But I'm thinking what Dugin's doing is seizing in on that, saying that's what Western democracy is. It can't be a populist democracy. And again, they're not defining that either. So but Dugin does at least give you a definition, whereas Henri Lévy's definition is really an example and then an association.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, I mean, if the idea is, you know, I mean, different cultures have different ideas about whether individuals or collective groups are more important, which, by the way, is super interesting to see somebody like Dugin just embracing that, because like usually that's what I hear as like a caricature of what socialists think. You know, it's like, oh, you don't think that individual human beings are important. You just think that some big collective entity that you want to absorb them into is important. And so it's interesting to kind of see Dugin embracing that. But that, like, you know, so Russian culture thinks that, you know, that according to Dugin, that that collectives are more important than individuals, and you shouldn't have, you know, democracy may be restrained by certain kinds of protection of the rights of, you know, minorities, and in general that, you know, rejects certain kinds of Western liberal values, and then you should respect that. Then I mean, I guess I've got to say, I mean, maybe this is simplistic, but it's like, I mean, yes, I agree. He's made a lot clearer than Henri Lévy is, you know, like good for him for that. But like, I mean, the obvious sort of simplistic response is, okay, why should I respect that, right? Like is there some kind of implied shared, you know, normative framework that isn't just dependent on what some culture says? Should I respect it because my culture says that I should respect it? Should I respect it for some other reason? If so, I'd like to hear more about that, and that might like clarify what this means to say that Western values are or aren't universal. I mean, like I don't know. I mean, I guess my strong bias here is towards the approach in like the last chapter of Against the Web, you know, to say that, you know, within giant cultural traditions, you know, people always like, you know, like are going to find their ways to a number of different values, including the ones that we like, you know, we meaning like the left, and express them in the language of that culture, which I guess means that technically I'm in the gross position of sort of agreeing with Henri Lévy's point, which is that he says, well, look, you know, if you're going to say Russian culture rejects this, I mean, you know, not all Russians, right? You know, and then he sort of starts talking about the Russians that he likes. I mean, I guess Dugin could, you know, still have some pretty plausible claim to that the stuff that he likes is more popular in Russia. But I mean, it just seems like a weird way to argue about this stuff. Like I don't like is it, you know, like it seems like you're at least having an interesting argument if you're arguing about whether it's good to have whatever liberal democracy means to Henri Lévy, who likes it, and means to Dugin, who doesn't like it. Like, if you're arguing about whether that stuff's good, then that's like, okay, I at least understand the terms of it. But arguing about whether, you know, whether it's universal, it's just very confusing to me what exactly that means. And then, yeah, as you say, like nihilist, like it seems like if anything, they're sort of indirectly having an argument about whether it's good, but they're having an argument about whether it's good by accusing the opposite position of being nihilistic, whatever that means.
Well, I mean, that's a call word of conservative revolutionaries. I mean, going back to de Maistre as to the accusation of nihilism. The interesting thing that we'll see Dugin do, and one of the things that we're going to have a problem with is Henri Lévy will mention, you know, liberalizers in the Russian tradition, but he doesn't seem to actually know anything but like the people who get brought up commonly in Isaiah Berlin books. I mean, to be frank, like I was looking at the names, I'm like, yes, the Russian thinkers. Because I'm like, okay, so he's going to mention Herzen, he's going to mention Turgenev and the nihilists, the people who called themselves nihilists in the 18th and 19th century. But they don't talk about the substance of like the Decembrist. They don't talk about the absolute Russian state was actually kind of an import from France. And so you just feel like if Henri Lévy was being more detailed and more specific in his claims, then he might land something on Dugin. But as you'll watch, because I've watched this debate a couple times now, Dugin has an answer for the names he throws out, and Henri Lévy can't respond. And then Henri Lévy will try to claim somebody in a minute that's going to really open it up to some problems. So, yeah, that's what I'd say. I'd say it's interesting because I think it's interesting to me because the other thing about Russian culture is Russia's not a unified culture. Right. It's never been. And part of the Tsarist state and the Orthodox mission in Russia was kind of a nation building project that was never completely completed in the Russian Empire. And like a historian could probably come at Dugin about this, but Henri Lévy just actually he accepts, for example, that it's meaningful to say a unified Russian tradition, which by itself is already granting a whole lot to Dugin.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I will say, by the way, you brought up Plato's Dialogues, which I actually think is a good example of what's not going on here, because in those, sure, the definitions come out over the course of it, but they don't.
But they are defined.
but they come out over the course of explicitly talking about what you mean and saying hey, so. Gosh, what do you mean by holiness? Well, I mean, it's like, but does that make sense? And I'd love that, right? Like if they started arguing about what nihilism meant, as opposed to just accusing each other of being nihilists or supporting things that are nihilists, and it's also I don't know, even when it, I feel like I have a little bit of a handle on what Dugin could mean by it, because I sort of know what it means, going back to those conservative figures earlier you were talking about. I sort of know what it means for some ultra reactionary traditionalist to call somebody who likes modern liberal stuff a nihilist. Like it's, I don't think it's accurate, but I understand that, right? But it's like, okay, well, you're rejecting the sort of traditional values that are gluing everything together, and you're not really going to have anything to replace it with. And I can kind of wrap my mind around what they're thinking when they say that. But when Henri Lévy says that the Nazis are nihilists, the Stalinists are nihilists, it's like, what? Nazis are bad, right? I'll make that bold statement, but not because they don't believe anything. Right.
Yeah, it's not like they didn't believe in anything. I mean, there is a rhetorical tradition on even the far left, I'm thinking of Pasolini, to accuse fascists of being nihilist, and that was actually kind of a troll, because that's what the radical right philosophers were accusing everybody else of. So saying you are the real nihilist, like in Pasolini movie Solo. I get what they're doing, but Henri kind of does that without any of the work or the context, or even trying to justify his point.
Fair enough. All right, let's watch some more.
I agree. I think that's phenomenon of fascism and National Socialism. I agree, it is nihilism. I agree, and I don't defend that, because it is modern phenomenon. In my eyes, all modernity is purely nihilist. And liberalism is nihilist, communism is nihilist, and fascism as well. And I think that I agree with you about the crimes committed by Hitler, because my people as well suffered a lot. We have lost many, many millions of the people killed because they were Slavs, as exactly on the same scale as they were Jews. And our people, Soviet people, Russian people, fought this patriotic war in order to stop the fascism in Europe, in Russia, and as well to save all the peoples suffering in that situation. And I strongly blame all kind of racism. So if I find something interesting in Heidegger and Schmidt in conservative revolution in Germany, it is the points of some political realism, on some geopolitical thought, on some traditionalism, and the criticism of modernity that was proper to this conservative movement, but not the racism. I always, in all my books, I always stress, and if I am bold enough, if I would fascist or racism, to recognize that. I am making many bold statements. I am blamed for them. I am against liberalism, against individualism, against human rights as ideology, but I am against racism too. And that is clear. I don't defend that. But I don't think racism I blame, because it is Anglo-Saxon liberal construction based on the hierarchy between the people. I think this is criminal. And I think that the same crime now, the globalism repeats, because what globalists, the liberals, as yourself and the people who support your ideas, now try to affirm as universal values are simply modern Western liberal values. And that is a kind of new kind of racism, cultural, civilizational racism. You say, you affirm, everybody who accepts open society, they are good guys. All who challenge the open society, they are, as Popper in the subtitle of his book says, they are enemies of open society. So there's a new Manichaean division, that new racism. Who is in favor of Western values, they are good. Everybody who challenged that in Islamic tradition, in Russian tradition, in Chinese tradition, in Indian tradition, in everywhere, they are populist and they are classified as fascism. I think that is new racism.
Oh, my dear. There is really three real points of disagreement. First of all, I'm sorry, but when you speak of globalization, you have a short idea of it. Globalization does not mean there is a bad globalization, of course, which means uniformization of the world. But globalization, as a lot of Western thinkers conceive it, like as I conceive it, like many people here in Amsterdam conceive it, means not an uniformity, means an openness to the other, means some bridges between civilization, means some nexus between cultures, means some importation, exportation of words, theorems, and so on. This is what globalization can mean too. And believe me, we are very numerous in the West to battle for that. Number two, when you say that to believe in universal values is a new form of totalitarianism and so on, I'm sorry, but this is so short. The real point is that in every civilization, there are some great things which have been invented. Your civilization, the Russian one, which is a proper civilization, great, which I revere and respect, invented, for example, through Alexander Solzhenitsyn, one of my masters, invented the very idea of the fight against totalitarianism. It's huge what Solzhenitsyn did, and nobody will steal that hugeness from Russian culture. So many Western thinkers tried to think freedom against totalitarianism, what it is, what is a camp, and so on. It belongs to a Russian man to have produced this masterpiece, which was the archipelago of Gulag. Nobody will take that from Russian civilization.
I didn't want to pause and get this quickly, but I got to say, well-known advocate of liberal democracy and human rights, Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah, I know. I was like, have you read anything beyond the Gulag Archipelago or what Anne Applebaum has to say about it? Because no.
Yeah,
anyway,
pretty sure Solzhenitsyn would not be on Relavia's side of this particular debate. But okay.
On the same sense, Europe invented a few things also which are gains for humanity. For example, equal rights between women and men. For example, the right for a body not to be tortured, not to be enchained or enslaved. This right has been invented, has been produced by a philosophy which has been called the philosophy of enlightenment and which birthplace was Europe. So the idea is not to impose a pattern on another one. It is to take in every civilization the good for the rest of humanity that it invented. And I'm happy to hear that you don't like racism, but I'm not so sure that you are sincere. I read a few days ago a book of you called La Révolution conservatrice in French, page 256 and 56, where you spoke about Jews. I'm not only concerned about Jews, I'm concerned about all, but this one was about Jews and about the metaphysical rivalry and war between Aryans, and Jews. And you said that this was a challenge, that this was a debate of not of the century, but of the time. This is anti-Semitism. And I'm not surprised, because all the men which you quoted and from which you draw your inspiration, Spengler, Heidegger, who is also a great philosopher, of course, and others, they are contaminated, corrupted, infected by this plague, which is anti-Semitism. And alas, you too. And in your debates with Alain de Benoit in France, with your connections with Alain Soral, who prefaced one of your books and who is one of the, alas, of the leaders of the French anti-Semitism, all of this perspires. So how can you say that racism is foreign to you?
So absolutely foreign to me. I as well, I think that I believe that people have their angels. People have their archetypes. So the peoples are not only collective of bodies or physical presence, but the people have soul. And there is the soul of Jewish people that I admire, that I respect. I have many friends in Israel, in traditionalist circles of Israel that share my opinion. They are.
And want to pause again to note that anytime somebody says you're an anti-Semite, always the best move, the most convincing thing you could say is actually some of my best friends are Jewish.
I also want to point out, though, that one of the things that people who aren't familiar with Solzhenitsyn's full work aren't realizing what Dugin's doing. Dugin's taking that Soul's comment, that's straight from Solzhenitsyn, and he's baiting Henri Lévy with it, and Henri Lévy doesn't catch it. It's kind of an infamous speech. It's not actually that readily available in English, which was the Souls of Russians and the Souls of Jews speech that Solzhenitsyn did, I believe, in the late 80s, where he argued that the pogroms were indefensible, but that we shouldn't go back to the persecution of Jews, but the Jews should be kept separate from Russians and Russians kept separate from Jews so that they do not contaminate each other's cultures and lose their spiritual essence. That is what Dugin is picking up here. And he's almost using phrases from it translated in English verbatim. And it's interesting. Another thing that that is interesting, Evoler, Spengler, and again, I don't think Heidegger's Black Book even talk about that. I mean, one of the things that Evola used to complain about when the Nazis joined up with the Italian fascists, for example, is that they were too racialist, because racialism as a bloodline thing is modernist. If we're anti-Jewish, we should be anti-Jewish, not anti-Semites. And it's because of the differences in our souls and natures. And that was something Spengler talked about in the differences in civilizations. He was not a racialist, actually. I mean, and it's something that Evola talked about, something that Solzhenitsyn talked about. And I think it's a move that when Western liberals confront this kind of conservatism, because they think everyone's their stereotype of a Hitlerist Nazi. I mean, even the Italian fascists didn't all believe in biological race in this way, that they throw this at someone like Dugin and they just go, I don't believe in blood race. That's a modern concept. Moving on. And
right. And I should also say, because we kind of alluded to this earlier, but didn't really like go into any detail. Anybody who might watch this who's only familiar with the Gulag Archipelago, yes, we already talked about some of Solzhenitsyn's views about Jewish people. I believe the Dugin position you talked about earlier, that all of the eastern Ukraine should be annexed by Russia. I believe Solzhenitsyn would have actually outflanked that from the right. I think he made some statements about how there shouldn't be an independent Ukraine at all. Seems to, it was basically like this older reactionary monarchist, Orthodox, Christian, traditionalist, nationalist. So, I mean, that was just an extremely, I think that moment, if nothing else, I think it shows that Henri Lévy has not doesn't know very much about the terrain that he's talking about, right? I mean, he's debating a Russian nationalist, and he's bringing up, famous writer, Soviet dissident. Okay, he'll be who I plug in, for the liberal democratic values, without actually bothering to find out, very much about him. Which, as you pointed out when we were talking before we started streaming, some of this stuff, I mean, I know he cited a page number earlier, but also, makes you wonder how much of Dugin he actually read before this.
Just skimmed to find mention of minority ethnic groups, and brought it up because he doesn't seem to understand the context. I mean, it is amazing to me, actually, though, because the Nouveau Philosophes, which Henri Lévy is part of, do consider Solzhenitsyn super important to their movement, but you don't get the feeling that they've read anything but maybe part of the Gulag Archipelago. It's just, because they attach him to like Karl Popper and that whole sort of, English liberal, Austro-English liberal thinking, and that's really strange if you read anything else by Solzhenitsyn. So, anyway,
yeah, right, yeah.
I mean, like a warning to the West, but like that book from the 80s should make it abundantly clear that Solzhenitsyn was not a liberal at all. You know, it's kind of something else that they don't seem to acknowledge that. And you think, considering that they do talk about him as crucially important to their movement in France, about why they broke off with, like, I mean, because Althusser was one of Henri Lévy's professors. So, like, there is a way in which this was a way to distinguish yourself from the people older than you. But it's very strange that they don't seem to know much about Solzhenitsyn, or if they do, they're not letting it be known. Consequently, though, and then we can move on. Dugin saying that he opposes fascism is interesting. He does in the 2009 book Fourth Positionism, because he sees Fourth Positionism as pulling from the best elements of liberalism, communism, and fascism and re-traditionalizing them. That's what he thinks the fourth position is, and re-embracing existence, Dasein, the Heideggerian term. But in 1999, he said this. So, I mean, it's something where I kind of can't believe that they didn't do this much research. In Russian Orthodox Christianity, a person is part of the church, part of a collective organism, just like a leg. So how can a person be responsible for himself? Can a leg be responsible for itself? Here is where the idea of state, the total state, originates from. Also, because of this, Russians, since they are Orthodox, can be true fascist. Unlike the artificial Italian fascists of the Gentile type, are their Hegelians. The true Hegelianism is Ivan Perestrov, the man in the 16th century who invented the Oprechnika for Ivan the Terrible, for Ivan Dostoevsky. He was the true creator of Russian fascism. He created the idea that the state is everything and the individual is nothing. Like, that's, you know, if you want to go after Dugin, you can quote that. That's from a Polish newspaper interview he did in 1999. Now, he distanced himself from that position in 2009, saying that fourth positionism, which is called that to indicate both a break in continuity with fascism, because fascism historically is third positionism in its Italian form. Now, and again, the American association with Hitlerism being the dominant form of fascism kind of makes this hard for us to interpret, because Nazism and Hitlerism in specific are really actually kind of the odd man out in you know, European fascism and their ideas, because they put the emphasis on the Volk, you know, the folk, the race, whereas the earlier fascists put the emphasis on the incorporate state, the corporate state with all classes working together to build this, you know, total unified integral. And modern post-fascists will often call themselves integralists. Like there's a group of non-racialist Catholic people who are properly speaking, they're not calling them fascists, is a little wrong. They're post-fascist, but call themselves integralists, operate on the same theory. And Henri Lévy just seems to be blind to these differences, or just not acknowledge that they're there, or doesn't want to dig into it. Like, it's very strange that, because he could fight back on Dugin claiming that he's totally distant from fascism if he actually mentioned more of Dugin's work. But he seems to just go to like this one passage that mentions Jews and go, gotcha, you're an anti-Semite. And Dugin just is prepared for that. He knows that's coming.
Right. Yeah, right. That's why he prepared the Solzhenitsyn paraphrase. Yeah, so I mean, like in a weird way, as grotesque as I find everything about what Dugin believes, like I kind of respect the trolling, like when he says, no, I'm not a fascist. What are you talking about? Fascism is part of your degenerate modern world. You know, I'm like a feudalist or something, you know, like that's fun.
Jews who believe in God, and that is in confrontation with you. They define yourself as Jew not believing in a Jewish God. For them, for my friends, it would be absolutely anti-Semitic affirmation, because the Jews are the people of God, and that is the essence. So without God, the Jews lose their essence, religious mission, that place in the history. But that is important, that there are differences between the people, and I'm insisting on the difference between souls of the people, between the angels of the people. But I am against any kind of hierarchy or racism. I don't say that the Indo-European or Greek or European, South German, Indian, Iranian civilization are better, or tradition better, say Semitic or Islamic or Judaic. I think they are different. And concerning the globalization process you have described, if it would be so as you have said, we would have nothing against that. If that is dialogue, when everybody participates, Christian, Muslim, Chinese, defending their set of values, if globalization will be the open and just and really democratic dialogue in order to find the better in all the civilization, nobody would oppose to it, I think. At least myself, I wouldn't oppose. But now it is the Western projection of what Western thinks is good or bad as universal value, capitalism, market economy, human rights ideology, individual freedom, hedonism, technocracy, all these elements of Western historical experience, social experience, are projected on the world scale, and that is called universal. So the West is called universal. I am against that. And concerning Solzhenitsyn, I follow him as well, because he was Slavophile, and he fought against communist totalitarianism precisely in favor of Russian people as collective identity. Solzhenitsyn. I am against Soviet totalitarianism. I'm not in favor. I'm not defending communism. I was dissident in 80s, but I'm not pro-liberal dissident as Solzhenitsyn. As Solzhenitsyn, I am anti-liberal. He was very critical, anti-liberal dissident. So I think Herzen, you have mentioned some name in Russian history. Most of them were Westerners. So they were ethnically or culturally Russian, but ideologically they were not Russian. They didn't follow our tradition, and our tradition was based on completely different anthropology and ontology. And Herzen, interesting, he was Westerner in the youth and immigration, but he returned after to the very nationalist position. So many, Turgenev not, but Herzen, yes, interesting. So one of the leader of the Russian Westerners, having experienced the West, the Western culture and immigration, returned as many our dissidents returning from the West with very nationalist ideas. So I think we should carefully conserve this identity, Jewish, Semitic, Islamic, Russian, European, in different forms, and try to find a nexus between them. So avoiding this simplistic version, totalitarianism against democracy. Hannah Arendt, that I admire as well, said that totalitarianism is modern phenomenon. It is not traditional phenomenon. So if we measure everything, democracy, liberalism, or fascism, or communist totalitarianism, it's simplistic version. I think now we need to imagine something else, something beyond the modernity. And in that sense, all three political theory, liberalism, communism, and fascism, they are the ideology to overcome, to get beyond them. But as well, there are something interesting in some communist thinker as Gramsci, for example, or some French communists as Bataille or Debord, or leftists. You are from the left. There are so many interesting thinkers. We could not make identification, for example, Bataille with Gulag. We could not say that Heidegger is the same as Svensson, or all liberals are Hiroshima bombing criminals. So we need to find something sane, or try to find something sane, but in order to overcome.
About Judaism, you have to revise a little your information. Judaism and God is a little more complicated like that than that. To be a Jew, of course, it is to have a relationship with God, but it's a relationship which is based on study more than in creed. And that is one of the main difference between Judaism and Christianity, but no problem. About Herzen, what you don't seem to understand, and what was the greatness of Herzen, was the ability to go back and forth, to enrich the Western tradition with the Russian tradition and vice versa. This was the greatness of Herzen, of Pushkin, of all the anti-Eurasian, the pro-European Russians of the 19th and of the 20th century. Sakharov, for example, who is, for me, another great heroes of the 20th century. He had a foot in Russia, and he had a foot in liberalism and democracy. He believed in the two, and he devoted all his life in the task of combining the two. And what I fear when I read you, and what I find when I read you, and not only you, all the writers of this Eurasian current, which is supposed to inspire Putin, and what I find so morbid, so smelling death, and so nihilistic, is the fact of conceiving these civilizations as blocks. Of course, I know you respect Islam, you respect Japanese civilization, you respect a Turkish civilization, and maybe the Jews. But on two conditions: that everyone remains at his place, and that there is as little communication between all of them. And this conception of culture, of civilizations considered as blocks, which are closed on themselves, you share it with an American thinker whom you know, and you should have quoted him more than Guy Debord. It is Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington, with his idea of clash of civilizations, is matching with the thinkers which you represent today in Russia, with this idea of blocks closed and virtually at war against each other. And when you look at Vladimir Putin today, when you look at what he's saying when he addresses Europe, when he addresses America, when he addresses human rights and so on, when he addresses Ukraine, when he aggresses Ukraine in Crimea, it is a discourse of war. So a philosophy of war, civilizations conceived as holistic blocks, has as a natural outcome a practice of war which is implemented by Vladimir Putin today. And I really believe that between your Huntington way of thinking and the occupation of Crimea, the 13,000 deaths in Ukraine, the war in Syria, with this bloodbath, tragic and horrible, there is a link between the two.
I agree. I appreciate very much Huntington. I think his vision It's much more correct than Fukuyama or liberalism, that civilization exists. And after the fall of these two ideological camps, communism against capitalism, the civilization will play a decisive role in the history. I don't think, in Huntington, I agree as well, there is a kind of simplistic vision of civilization. I have dedicated my last 24 books to the study of civilizations, trying to find the differences inside of them. So trying to describe them
I'm not
in a
speaking of
complex
differences.
way.
I'm speaking about bridges. Differences we all know, but did you devote as many books to find some bridges, some connections? Difference, I know. Bridges.
Yes, interesting. So when we try,
For sure.
when we try to exchange, to build the bridges too early, without knowing the structure of the other. The problem is the other. The West don't understand the other as something positive. It's all the same, and we immediately try to find the bridges. They are illusions and not the bridges, because we are projecting ourselves. It is the same. The ideology all the same. Otherness, we need first to understand. 24 books dedicated to understand the other than ourselves, the West, then Islamic, Jewish, European, Russian thought considered to something that is known. I think that civilizations are unknown actors. They're emerging now, and we need to study them first correctly, and after that to create the bridges.
Do you come often to America? Do you come often to United States?
From time to time. Now I'm sanctions, but under sanctions. But
okay, because I hope you will be allowed to go back. You discover in American universities, nothing is more active than these departments of studies of the otherness. This is one, by the way, America has a lot of defects, a lot of problems, but one of the greatness of America today, and since long, but today more than ever, is this attention to the otherness, is this very insightful look in the body and in the soul of all foreign cultures. You cannot imagine how vivid, vibrant, open to the other are the American universities, and sometimes also the French universities. So knowledge of the otherness we have in the West. Unfortunately, opening our arms, our hearts, and your arms and your hearts to the otherness, not enough. Now you said I'm right. Okay, one question. What do you think about the aggression of your country? Me, when France aggressed Algeria when I was a boy, I was 14 years old, I was in the streets. When America aggressed Vietnam, I was demonstrating. Today, what do you think of the occupation of Crimea? And what do you think of...
That's, I think it's significant that to find American French military interventions that he was against, he has to go back to Algeria and Vietnam.
Right. I mean, we're not going to mention Libya. We're not going to mention Iraq. We're not going to mention. There's so much that came out in that. For those who don't know, neither side actually portrayed Herzen particularly well. Herzen started off as a Hegelian in the early 19th century. Went to the West, went back to Russia. He is a key founder of peasant socialism, and it's against him who like Plekhanov and Lenin are distancing themselves. Although Herzen's positions were actually closer to Marx's in the letters to Verozolics, but that's another thing. He was a major inspiration to the Narodnik movement, which is the populist movement, which is a quasi-nationalist movement. But we have to remember that saying that he was embracing the Russian civilization is a little strange when what he was, even as an inspiration to the Narodniki, he was actually pushing against serfdom, against the traditional lord rights, against the Volgars and Volvoids and the various titled aristocrats in the Russian Empire. And so he does end up abandoning Hegelianism, but he is more, you can't call him an embracer of like Tsarist civilization, but he also did think that basically peoples should be allowed, both with individual rights, he never gives that up, to develop their cultures somewhat uniquely with a tie to the land in a socialist context where they take care of each other. And so both of them are like cutting part of the Herzen argument out. And it seems dependent on you not really knowing who Herzen really was. The stuff on the other, I mean, okay, so what Dugin is doing here is using Emmanuel Levinas against, a Sephardic French Jew against Henri Lévy, and Henri Lévy just goes, well, they really respect others and in American universities, there's all these. He's basically referring to ethnic studies as the respect for the other, which is kind of wild. And then he says, and sometimes we do that in France and Europe, but not really. We're not going to talk about that either. And it's wild to me that there's that bait and switch going on, because what you actually, if you were going to actually fight here, when the Henri Lévy seems to land the Huntington comparison, and then Dugin just embraces it. Like, yeah, Dugin. One of the key points to Dugin's philosophy, which I mentioned at the very beginning, is tuliarchy versus talasarchy, which is the idea of land state versus water state, or mercantile states versus agrarian powers. And so he talks about the Qing and the Mongol and the Russian powers and early France, and the Sultan and the Islamic sultanates, the caliphates, which he puts in there. But he then defends like the land-based sultanates are like the Omani Sultanate. He defends because it's relatively closed off, and like Shiite enclaves, which is why a lot of people will think Dugin's anti-Islamic, because it comes up in the context of Chechnya, because he was big on the annexation of Chechnya. And Georgia and actually. But one thing that he would say is that he's against like the Sunni thalassocracy, the mercantile expansionist Sunni Muslims, where he would be for the kind of tuliarchy land-based Shia Muslims. So positive towards Iran, positive towards Hezbollah, which also interestingly more or less lines up with Russia's current geopolitical orientation in the Middle East. And so one thing that I just find interesting that Henri Lévy doesn't point out is you can't respect all the others if you actually think empires are inherently at war. And the context of war is actually interestingly brought up by Dugin himself in the very first statement of the debate and then dropped, which it's just weird. I keep, you watch this, you end up like respecting Dugin's debating powers, but you just feel like the Henri Lévy like did such superficial research that he has no idea how to hit him at all. Right. And everything that that Henri Lévy throws on him that should stick. I mean, like the Hertzen comment should stick a little bit. It doesn't. I mean, and he actually allows Dugin to get away with playing no true Russian. Like, you know, the Westerner Russians, they were just ethnically Russian. They weren't really true Russians. And Henri Lévy just lets it fly. Like, he doesn't argue with that at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, that which would have been a really good chance to actually start to argue about the ideas instead of just sort of exchanging free floating judgments, which is what a lot of this has been, right? Like I mean, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like okay, hey, you know, what about Huntington? Yeah, I like Huntington. Okay, you know, like just, you know, tell me a little bit more about why Huntington is bad, and maybe we could have an interesting debate.
For the aggression of Eastern Ukraine by paramilitaries or militaries of your country.
In your book, you say you deplored that you manifested against Americans. So you can, we can change our minds. So you are defending the American empire, the world liberal empire, and that is your option or your choice that I respect. I think that I defend Eurasian civilization as not as the country. I'm not too much patriot of the Russian Federation and all our government does. I'm not automatically support all that. I have critical...
Crimea.
Yeah, I'm coming. I'm approaching. So, in my opinion, there are the Ukraine is the country with two people and two civilizations. They're ethnically very, very close because it is not Ukrainian people. They're Ukrainian. It is the part of and the cradle of Russian civilization. In some way, Ukrainians are more direct parents of us. They are pure Russians. They are more pure Russians than ourselves because they live still in the cradle of our tradition, and we migrated to the east. So historically, Ukraine was created by two tendency of aggression of Russian Empire. Aggression against Turkey, because the new Russia, Novorossiya, was the part of Turkish territories in Crimea and eastern modern days Ukraine, and the other part was taken from Poland, and that was it wasn't liberated or created by Western Russian so-called Ukrainians. So Russia has historically, during aggression against the neighbor countries, created Ukraine, and the last piece of it was added by Stalin from Austria-Hungary, the Lvov district. So that was composed entity that appeared after the fall of the Soviet Union. And there was a chance to create Ukrainian identity. As, for example, there is Belgium identity with two people living, considering, respecting each other. So there are two people. And if, for example, the Wallons would like to say that Flemish, they are a second type of the subhuman, because they are German, for example, or Protestants. That was exactly the same that happened to the Ukraine. The state, the newly born state that didn't exist in the history, had the chance to create its national idea, national structure, respecting both people living there in Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine, and to find a balance. And I supported that. And I have the partisans, including in the Western Ukraine, sharing this view. But finally, politically, that was only the part, Western part, that in Maidan, where you were trying to inspire them to get off from so-called Russia, and that part, Western part, has submitted the other. Russia intervened in order to say these part of Ukraine. And after we have committed the error, I think, we should liberate the eastern Ukraine with Crimea and to propose to recreate Ukraine independent as bridge between us and Europe, and basing on the respect of both identities. And that was the mistake, that we have taken only Crimea or only Donbass. It was a mistake. We should restore and reconstruct Ukraine. When Yanukovych was...
For the moment, the only bridge which exists, which has been created, is between Crimea and Russia. For the moment, the only building which has been done is a huge military basis in Sebastopol of Russia, directed against enemies, I suppose. And I don't see in the last years, in the speeches of Putin or others, any tendency to rebuild a binational great Ukraine. I see a pure and rabid aggression and violation of the international law. I see an attempt of rewriting and of revising history that, by the way, if I understood you well, you are pursuing today. When you say that Ukraine is a new state, this is what I heard. How can you say that? Ukraine, that's a point of history, existed before Russia.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
In that sense,
okay.
this
is the
history,
9th century before year 1000.
That was the common history.
The Rus of Kiev, the Prince Volodymyr, who was baptized and who is at the origin of the Christianization of modern Ukraine and modern Russia, was a prince of Kiev, not of Moscow. So Ukraine is an old country, more ancient than Russia. Okay, so every countries are new. So the best we can do, Mr. Dugin, the best we can do is to respect, as imperfect as they are, the international laws, the laws that might prevent us to fall in another catastrophe like the one who costed your people 24, 25 million brave soldiers and civilians destroyed by Hitler, and who costed Europe such a ruin. There is an architecture of security which has been built after the Cold War, in cooperation, by the way, between the West and Russia, at many steps, and we have to do our best for our children. I don't know if you have children.
Yes.
Okay.
And grandchildren.
Grandchildren. Okay. For them, we have to do our best to preserve and to save this imperfect but decisive and crucial architecture of security. And what Putin did in Crimea, what he's doing at this very minute in eastern Ukraine, what he's doing when he plays with fire and with massacre and bloodbath in Syria, goes against the interests of our children and grandchildren.
I don't think so. I agree on the principle that...
Okay. Wow. Henri Lévy landed one hit in that, which is that all the nations are new, but he did it kind of offhandedly, and just dropped it. He didn't go like, full Hobsbawm and talk about invented traditions, and that there isn't really continuities. I mean, there's not really a continuity between the Kievan Rush and the Muscovy Principate and the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. But he kind of wanted to grant it and then take it away. Like, oh, well, Ukraine's an older country. Well, modern Ukraine is a product of the 1990s. And the context, I think the context that they're both talking around and don't mention is that the issue was that Russia was heavily pushing influence on the Ukrainian political process, but at the same time, the West was intervening, trying to get Ukraine into NATO in a way that violates all promises NATO made to Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union and also to Yeltsin at the beginning of the Russian Federation. Like, so to bring up international law in that context, I mean, yes, actually, in some sense, what Russia did was against the treaties that established everything, but NATO had already violated that. And they're not even, like, it's interesting that Dugin doesn't even bring that up. He'd rather stay in this vague discussion about civilizations and, like, how the Kievan Rush, or, like, where do the Russians come from, and there's actually some weird, like, he doesn't normally talk about this, but there's some weird blood and soil stuff where he says they're even more true Russians than us Russians because they didn't leave the homeland. And not deal with the fact that this is beating around the bush of a geopolitical conflict where both sides have effectively lied.
Well, and especially, like, you know, I think that the problem is, like, you kind of, I mean, to condemn, you know, what Putin did, you know, in you know, taking, you know, Crimea and, you know, this stuff, like, I think you have to kind of be like a pretty, for it not to just ring totally hollow. I mean, yeah, you could do the international law condemnation, although, you know, God knows, you know, like,
I mean, the U.S. has effectively ended the quote rules-based liberal order like 20 years ago anyway. So
exactly. Like there's not, like, I mean, it seems like, you know, international law is more for some people than others, and Henri Lévy seems to be very untroubled by lots of other violations of it, like those other wars we were talking about earlier. But if you're not just going to do the international law condemnation, then, like, you kind of have to be. And when I say imperialist here, I don't necessarily mean to be getting into, like, all of the sort of like, you know, intra-Marxist stuff about exactly what imperialism means, or whatever, but just in the colloquial sense of imperialism, you know, that you kind of have to be like a principled anti-imperialist to condemn it without it just ringing totally hollow, because of course, like, look, if there was some, you know, I mean, if you know, if the Warsaw Pact existed, and now, you know, right now, and Russia was trying to get Mexico to join it, like, what do you think the United States would do? I mean, like, that, you know, the question answers itself, you know, like you have to, and you can say, well, I don't like the way that great powers treat these things, and I'm just against that in general, right? And that's consistent, you know, but treating it as if it were this, like, huge anomaly that's, like, you know, everybody else has conducted themselves according to some kind of reasonable rules, and it's like, oh my God, what's going on over there? You know, like that's going to be pretty, you know, that's going to be pretty hard to sustain.
Yeah, I mean, the Mexico example is one we even can look at from history, because Wilson sent troops in to Puebla upon the I mean, like, where in World War I, Mexico might kind of sort of look at maybe allying with Germany,
right.
Because I don't know, maybe it has reasons to fear Americans, since it, I don't know,
right.
lost so
all
much
of, you know, just see all of Mexican history, basically.
Right.
Yeah, right. No, fair enough. Yeah, and again, like I agree. Like, Henri Lévy's best point was that thing for like 5 seconds about how all nations are new, because you know, because when he's trying to do the, well, Ukraine is older anyway. I think he's trying to play this game about, like, you know, taking seriously the idea that all these national continuities that, like, you know, for one thing, I mean, just if you're arguing with a hardcore Russian nationalist who spends all of his time thinking about this stuff, right? You know, he's probably going to have more to say about that, right? Like that, like what the relationship is between these different national configurations that existed at different national times, and I think you could say, well, this is all, you know, like, sort of, tried to reverse engineer a tradition from like the needs of current nationalism, and that's largely true. Like that it's that all of this sort of attempt to talk about like, anything that was happening 500 years ago as if it really has anything to do, with why, Putin annexed, the Ukraine, like is kind of nonsensical. But instead of doing that, like he was doing it for a second, all nations are new, but for the rest of the time, he was trying to play the same game that Dugin is, by talking about stuff from centuries past as if it were relevant, to these national, these national configurations now. And it's also a little weird because I think if you're going to say, okay, so there are two problems with the international law objection. One is that it just rings so hollow because the countries that Henri Lévy likes, have made such nonsense of it, in the post 9/11 era. But then, the other problem is you're arguing with the guy who says that like, the problem with fascism is that it's too modern. Like, I don't know how much like, oh, this is the post World War II international law framework is supposed to, how far that's supposed to go in an argument with him.
Yeah, I mean, he's already said I fundamentally reject it. See it as cultural racism, and I mean, it's hilarious that, I mean, it does. For lefties in the world, I think this should make us worried about liberals, because in these arguments, they really don't seem to have a leg to stand on, and when they do, they don't take it. They take like, and I think Henri Lévy seems almost like a caricature of the centrist liberal right now. I mean, it's like, man, I almost think Tony Blair could have done a better job, which is pathetic. But it's interesting, and I am going to be interested to go back and see what Fukuyama and Dugin do, because I think that would be a much more substantive debate.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me that there is a real sense in which like all they can stand on is this legal order off of the promise of not having war, ignoring the war that they are aggressing in sometimes, and going back to like, I mean, it's interesting. You're right that he goes back to Vietnam to talk about this in Algeria, because also as a new philosophe, he's actually broken with that tradition already. Like that was an explicit rejection of the new left.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's like, when you, I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, whatever. I think this is like a more complicated case once you really get into it, but it's kind of like my instinctive reaction to the places where 2009 Hitchens would try to like shore up his credentials on some subject and be like, well, I've said this since 1971. It's like, yeah, in 1971 you're a Trotskyist. I don't think that like that's really relevant. That's like, oh, give me some more recent, give me some more recent evidence.
Not only were you a Trotskyist, but your paleo-conservative brother was a Trotskyist too. Like that's you're pulling from the past here dishonestly. Yeah. It is interesting. I what's interesting to me is Henri Lévy is consistently posited when I see him presented to the U.S. as a leftist of some variety, and I find that amazing because even in the U.S. context, I imagine his arguments coming from Alan Dershowitz, not from anybody associated with with even the liberal left. It's I mean, we do have this whole reassertion from, like, I guess the humanitarian interventionist ring of the Democratic Party that would sound a lot like this. The people who are talking about rules-based international order all of a sudden, but I don't even hear most. I mean, I wouldn't associate these talking points with any left in America, even the one I don't like over there in the Democrats.
That seems right. I think. Yeah, and I will say actually, I do disagree a little bit with Hadron there. I think that Fukuyama, I don't like the substance of his views, but he does strike me much more than Bernard-Henri Lévy as somebody who, reads books and thinks about them.
And could talk about cultural continuity and discontinuity. I mean, he wrote 2 massive tomes on it when he flipped from being a neoconservative to whatever he is now.
Yeah, he's kind of a weird, ambiguous, he kind of likes social democracy again now, but he has, but yeah, actually, I mean, I think that it's a. The end of history is one of those things that, probably more than any book since Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, people only read the title and only,
right.
And have opinions about it completely, entirely based on
and also missing that even in the Bush administration, he had disowned the thesis. Right. But anyway, let's continue. That's a different debate.
No, for sure. But I think that one would probably be better.
We need some international law, but law reflects the status quo, the balance of power. The law could not be absolutely abstract. For example, the law is established after the victory. When the West and the Soviet Union were together, we have won over Hitler. We established our international law. When the communism falls and the Soviet Union collapsed, there was attempt to create the Western-centered law based on the victory in the Cold War. And that law now, the international balance of power, is in decay. We are challenging it, and we try to create new international architecture that would respect civilizations. So I think we are coming to the end of the unipolar world system and structure based on this ideological and geopolitical victory, because the end of the unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer has said, now we have it. It is now. So civilizations reappear, and we could not put this emergence of civilizations in the old version of Westphalian national state system. Today we need to revise that in multipolar way in order to respect the other, accepted not only culturally. I agree with you about American universities, because I'm admirer of Boas tradition, anthropology on all his line, Franz Boas and Claude Lévi-Strauss. They are, for me, they are masters. I am following they're my teachers. This anthropological pluralism, I agree that is precisely American and French tradition, but it is not reflected in the politics or reflected in the very, very perverted way. So I think there is big contradiction between this anthropological thought in American universities, on French university, and kind of very aggressive colonial and neo-imperialist form to promote American interest on the world scale with the weapon. I could not blame only Putin for Syria, for example. You were active as well in the Libyan crisis that costed to the Libyan people the rivers of blood. So you suggested to overthrow Assad, and that was support of the part in this civil war against the other. So I think that we could not accuse in that situation only Putin. It is a perverted image. Putin reacted. Putin tries to affirm Russian voice and Chinese voice as well in this situation. That is five king against empire. You are on the side of empire, so you are accused on all the crimes the five king. We are five kings.
I am on the side of Solzhenitsyn. I am on the side
he was one of them, of
Bukovsky. I am on the side of Anna Politkovskaya. I am on the side of Leonid Pliouch. I am on the side of so many of my dead very often, and sometimes leaving Russian friends. I'm on their side too, believe me. The big disagreement between us, and we are advancing to the end, is the following. First of all, multipolarism is not a new thing. There has always been multipolarism. And before the collapse of Soviet Union, there was a big multilateralism between America, Russia, China. So it's not such a new thing, number one. Number two, you say that everyone should respect the other one and not interfere in the process of the other civilization. If you look honestly at the situation of today, the one who interferes, the one who tries really, genuinely to destabilize the other is not Trump destabilizing Russia, it is Putin destabilizing America and Europe. Today, there is not, Mr. Dugin, believe me, I know that, and these are facts, and they will be fact-checked. You cannot find one extreme rightist and neo-fascist party in Europe which is not at least blessed and at best financed by Russia. You cannot find one crisis in Europe which is not encouraged by Russia. You cannot count the number in 2014 and 15 of violation of the aerian space of Poland, Lithuania, and even sometimes France by Russian planes. You know, as I know, in 2014 and 15, the little declaration of Putin, who is a good chess player, saying that one should revise the legality, en passant, comme ça, just bypassing, the legality of the process of independence of the Baltic states. Another sentence saying that from Russia to Moscow it will take 2 hours, and so on. So today, the real imperialism, the real one who is interfering and suing some disorder in the and intervening in the affairs of the other one, alas, is Putin. And I'm not speaking, I should speak of America, where it is now proved that there has been a huge, crude, and evident intervention in the electoral process of the last election. And last remark, Syria, Libya, and so on. These are not civil wars. Again, civil war is a false concept, and you are too wise to make this mistake. It is wars against civilians. Syria, Libya, other places. It is war of a state, of an army. It was in Libya, and it is still in Syria, war against civilians. What is true is that you have people in the West, like me, and in Russia also, and in Ukraine, who took part for the civilians in Libya in order to prevent the bloodbath, in order to prevent what happens today in Syria, which is 400,000 dead, 3 million displaced people, and so on. That is true, but it has nothing to do, it cannot be compared to what a big state, Russia, does with its big planes, with the gas of Bashar al-Assad, which is to feed the war of aggression of a butcher, Bashar al-Assad, who does not care about our discussion about civilizations, bridges, blocks, and so on, who is just an executioner supported today by your president.
So I think that so many exaggerations and rhetoric figure that I'm not inclined to answer, not because I have no answer. For example, about intervention. On one side, it was proof that there was no intervention in favor of Trump, and there was intervention in favor of Hillary, of some Russian oligarchs. So the same for financement of far-right movement in Europe. There are many rumors, there are many publications, there are many rhetorics or intervention of Russia, most absurd from all of them in the Catalonia crisis, but no proofs. But nevertheless, what is interesting, we are in certain, I don't like to speak about the facts now. About the facts, because I consider
So you want to speak about what, if not the facts?
Facts are something that was done. The facere, Latin term, that was deeds, that was construction. In the informational age, we are dealing with informational facts. So who controls the media, as Guy Debord has said, control the facts. So if we don't want to...
Readers and journalists, mostly. Who controls the media? Readers and journalists. A little tycoons, but a lot readers and journalists. They are the controllers of media.
The media.
At least in the West. This is one of the advantages of the West.
It is a kind of European version.
We have a discussion in France today about Le Monde, which is the biggest newspaper, and there is, and there is a project of the owners of Le Monde to bring their shares to a foundation which will belong to public interest. So Le Monde will belong, this is the good of Westernization, will belong to its readers and to its journalists.
We are speaking not about the owner. We are speaking about epistemology and the Michel Foucault concept. Who control epistemology? The mass media, for example, Régis Debray has said, being the advisor of Mitterrand, he could not achieve no plan with a support of president because of some resistance going from nowhere. So there are some epistemological center of control. They are not owner of media. Interesting that this is an epistemological struggle. So we have one created system of fact or chosen fact, biased fact, and explained in a biased way. And when Russia tried to do the same, to create our mass media, Russia Today, Sputnik, we are blamed to have the fake news. To say the truth, we both are producing fake news.
I tell you why. The big difference is that when Russia Today is invented, it is invented by verticality, democracy vertical, as you say yourself. It is founded by Putin. When you have a conflict of interpretation in the West between Le Monde and Le Figaro, between the New York Times and the Korean Science Monitor or whatever, it is a fight between professionals, individuals. It is a sincere attempt to find the truth. It is not a propaganda media coming from the sky of power. And this again is an advantage of the West. Because what is true, my dear Dugin, what is true is that we are out of the age where truth comes from the sky, like in Plato. It has to be searched. And it has to be searched with sincerity and genuineness. For that, we don't need the intervention of the state. We don't need the trolls manipulated by the Kremlin or by White House if they did it. We need, again, some readers, some journalists, civil society, all animated by a sincere and authentic will for truth, to speak like Friedrich Nietzsche.
This image is so beautiful that I
recommend that to Russia. I recommend to Russia. It's one of the beauties that democracy offers to Russia. And when you embrace it, it will not be Western. It will be a common good, and it will be Russian too.
When Bush was in Moscow and the moment of invasion of the United States in Iraq, he had said, please be patient. You will have democracy as well as in Iraq. Putin has said, thank you very much. We will find the other way to build our society. I think that the picture you've made is correct, but that has nothing to do with modern Western society, where it's purely totalitarian way to this of the fact description, not in the favor of small group of holder of one mass media or other, but a political elite rules, and they are in that sense a kind of Platonist, taking their truth from their liberal ideology. That is something Platonic as well. And the people are in the revolt against that in different countries, but as well in the West. I think the wave of populism, it is precisely the refusal of the European people, not right-wing or left-wing, refusal, normal middle European citizens, that is refuse of this absolutely abstract agenda of liberal elites. So I think that is not about state now. We are speaking about political elites.
Okay, there is this, you are a good observer, this happens in the West. But more generally, there is a big fight all over the world between liberal values and illiberal values. This fight crosses our countries too. You have some liberal in Russia, and we have some illiberals in Europe. And what is true is that liberalism faces the same sort of crisis of credibility and maybe of self-credibility as it faced in the 30s or at the very beginning of the 20th century. But in this fight, Mr. Dugin, I checked today, we are at the end of this debate, that we will be on the two sides of the barricade, because for me, a free press is not totalitarianism. The cult or the respect of liberal ideas and of freedom is not another liberalism. Secularism, rights of women cannot be placed, as you did at the beginning of our encounter, at the same level than fascism and communism. There is today a real clash of civilization, but not the one you are quoting in your books between the North and the East and the West and the South and all of that. There is a clash of civilization all over the planet between those who believe in human rights, in liberty, in the right for a body not to be tortured and martyred, and those who are happy with illiberalism and revival of authoritarianism and slavery. And this is what makes the difference between you and me. I'm sorry to have checked it today again.
So, you said that nothing that Henri Lévy said sounds like anybody would consider left in the United States, and I basically agree with that. Certainly not how I'd use the word, but
the last bit did, actually.
Yeah, his weird thing about bodies being tortured did kind of sound like Ta-Nehisi Coates, how, that thing that like Coates introduced of like, it's like always talk about black bodies, instead of like black people. Like, it's always like a really weird, disconcerting rhetorical choice. and the way he said, and that sounded very Coates-esque at the end.
Yeah, there's that. There's also like I am thinking about the rhetoric around now, not so much with Russia, but with China, the international rules-based order talk that you hear, Danny Besner's made multiple points that like we're the people who destroyed that, even though we built it. We built it as a kind of like transatlantic super polity almost, and we destroyed it as well for reasons that frankly I don't entirely understand, even in terms of like imperialism. Because the Iraq War was which really over such small stakes in the terms of the grand transatlantic empire. One of the things about this debate is that, and I think maybe the audience will respond to it. It makes even to leftists, it makes the nationalist right sound better to fight that. Because like that order that Henri Lévy is defending is so bankrupt that it's like Dugin doesn't have to do that much work to land actual, stinging political truths when he talks about facts. And then I mean, I don't agree with Dugin's interpretation of Syria, or the West. I lived in the Middle East during the beginnings of that. Well, really the middle of that situation. But I thought for a second that Henri Lévy was going to say, don't call it a civil war. It's a war between empires. And I was no, he's not going to do that. There's always a war against the people. And I'm like, no, that's not what it is at all. It's a proxy war between different groups over geopolitical status. Like, duh.
Yeah.
And neither side can admit that because they both have to admit that they have stakes in a proxy war that has nothing to do with civilizational values on either direction. And to a degree that Henri Lévy would have to grant one of Putin's earlier Dugin's earlier contestations that a lot of Putin's monkey wrenching is defensive. And in fact, Dugin weirdly admitted you don't have proof of this, but yeah, we probably did do a lot of the stuff that you said because you did it to us. We wanted to. This is and to be fair to Dugin and the Russian right, they're not wrong.
No, for sure. And it's I mean it reminds me a little bit of the way that in 2016, when he was shocking media figures and normie Republicans like Donald Trump would disconcertingly say true stuff sometimes,
right.
That
Americans aren't exceptional. People forget that he said that.
Yes.
I've never been okay with American exceptionalism, which I've always found interesting because even his fans didn't pick that up. but I mean, yeah, particularly in 2015, 2016, when Trump was not winning and he didn't have any kind of devil's bargain with the GOP that he had to maintain.
No, exactly. I mean, when he, I think at this point didn't think that he had a shot really, and so he was just having fun being Republican Bulworth, and so he did I remember. I think at the first Republican debate, he was like, look, I know how corrupt all this stuff is. Everybody on the stage is taking money from me. I know I get favors for that, with real estate deals, or actually when they were talking about Putin and the was it there was an interviewer who said isn't he a killer? And he was like, yeah, but wait, you don't think we're killers? It was there were definitely some truth bombs in there from time to time early on. But yeah, I think that's right. Because I think when I think that Dugin would have had a much harder time debating somebody who had a pox in both their houses attitude towards the United States and Russia, but because Henri Lévy wants to fundamentally say that, portray, the U.S. and France and whoever as being, guardians of liberal democracy and rules-based international order and all of that stuff, then Dugin kind of wins just by saying true stuff about, come on, guys, you do all this too.
Right. I mean, it's also, he got Lévy to concede that political elites dominate even free media for reasons that they don't talk about, actually, like the access problem, the way market capture works. One of the things about the 20th century is we learned that you don't need state media for it to be propagandistic.
Right.
And what's interesting is Dugin just eventually, he fights against it for a little while and then does this thing with epistemology, which I think that's one of the points where everyone's rolling their eyes. And he's like, no, okay, we both do fake news. Fine. both our news is fake. It's both counter interpretation.
Yeah,
facts here.
Earlier you said that Dugin in some ways was kind of the ultimate example of what Matt's talking about with postmodern conservatism, and I mean, right there, right? Like he starts talking about Foucault to defend, like, wow, what is a fact, really? Like it's yeah. So I mean, it's like almost like a caricature of postmodern conservatism, but that as you say, I mean, he just ditched that like 10 seconds later. He's like, okay, whatever. We lie, you lie. It's just how the world works.
Right. I mean, another thing that I thought was interesting that Lévy didn't pick up on is Dugin's weird, both constant disavowal and ownership of the Soviet Union and the Soviet international and the Soviet international order. Which is something that I found very interesting that Lévy, because he's a devout anti-communist, didn't actually pick up on, that Dugin was having it both ways. Because he kept on referring to the Soviet Union as we. But then he also says he denounces it. And actually there is, in Dugin's thought, a more complicated relationship between the Soviet Union. He would actually stress the continuity between the Opreshnika and like the NKVD, but it's an interesting thing. I would also say that like you would far more likely to see Dugin quote Stalin than Lenin.
Well, I mean, that's I remember reading something by Zizek a while back where he points this out, that like, according to him, at least in Russia, like generally speaking, in like Putinist politics in Russia, like they like they're pretty friendly to Stalin, but not Lenin, because they can kind of assimilate Stalin the way that they do like the sort of great heroic czars who expanded the empire into their pantheon. But like, you talk about Lenin and that kind of reminds people that revolutions exist, and like that's not great.
Right. I mean,
not to mention, of course, that like, he gave up the empire, like in the initial revolution.
And the whole national policies thing, and that is something that's one of the interesting things. For example, if you actually read Dugin's book, The Foundations of Geopolitics, he considers all the Central Asian Islamic states to be part of the Russian sphere of influence, not a part of the Islamicate sphere of influence. So they're not with Iran, they're with us, even if they're not part of the Orthodox world. There's also a weirdness that he has with, if you actually know the intricacies of some of these Russian political philosophies, like Slavophilia and Eurasianism are actually not copacetic with each other. But he, particularly when talking to international audiences, plays both as part of his successor lineage, in a way that he wouldn't do in Russia. I mean, there is a sense, and I will say all this with the caveat that I don't read and speak Russian very well. I just know people who do. That there is a sense in which this is kind of cultivated for an international audience, but there is also a sense, and I've been told that this is true in his Russian writings as well, that the post-Marxist milieu particularly of the French and German 70s is really influential in Dugin's thought. I remember in fourth positionism, the 2009 book that I read. I must have read it 6 or 7 years ago. That Dugin not only mentions Derrida, but he makes a lot of use of like Baudrillard and Guy Debord, which he mentioned a lot tonight. And interestingly, also, you will notice that Dugin was smart enough to be baiting Henri Lévy with his own references, because Henri Lévy shamed him for using Guy Debord, and Dugin threw it back at him. I have to admit that I was actually a little bit rewatching it, surprised after watching it a third time, catching all the subtle things that Dugin was throwing back at him when you're realizing that they're both debating in a foreign language. being able to reference more Americans, being able to reference French philosophers, and actually reference them with quotations and theoretical glosses. Whereas what Henri Lévy did was basically just name drop.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I mean, like it got really bad. Like the second or third time he mentioned Solzhenitsyn, and Dugin was entirely correctly saying, no, he's one of us. and Henri Lévy just keeps plowing forward, like he's just gonna like recite his prayer, and like he has to like say all these people's names, in a row, without actually pausing to engage about that point, because Dugin is entirely right. He's like, yeah, Solzhenitsyn was a dissident. I was a dissident. We were both anti-liberal dissidents.
Right.
Like we didn't like communism, but that wasn't because we were liberals. And Henri Lévy was just totally unable to engage with that. Like it almost seemed like it's like, I don't know, man. Like, do you have a second example of a Russian dissident writer? I mean, could you just switch, rather than try to plow forward Solzhenitsyn?
Yeah, you could mention there were liberal ones, or you could even mention perestroika. You could bring up Gorbachev. You could do a lot, but you could mention Yugoslavia. You could talk about like Tito. You could do, there are better ways to do it, but again, it seems like, what I think a lot of people in the audience actually picked on this too. In a way, what you're seeing is a liberal reactionary fighting an illiberal reactionary. And in that sense, the way that Henri Lévy framed it is his worldview, that, it's the forces of liberalism, which we're defending, versus the forces of vague, nebulous, bad thing that we're fighting against. And it's anti-us. It's not even, doesn't even have its own substance. And one thing that I will say, that there were a couple of things that Henri Lévy said that do need to be like dealt with, that a lot of even the American left doesn't really deal with, and that is that there are Russian forces involved in
Syria.
In Syria, there are Russian forces involved in neo-reaction in Europe. Right. It's unclear that they have a relationship to the state, though. I mean, I don't say that to excuse Putin, but it is actually unclear that any of these people are operating under United Russia's orders.
I mean, in a way, it ironically could be like a weird right wing version of what you brought up Daniel Bessner earlier, like what he'll say when he's thinking about like a sort of hypothetical, well, I mean, he would say like Bernie Sanders presidency, but like something like the hypothetical really good version of what that would have been, not like not the slightly unsatisfied thing that it inevitably would have been if it had happened. But he'll say, well, okay, so on the one hand, we want to be in solidarity with oppressed people in other countries, but on the other hand, like, you surely want this hypothetical government to be like cooperating with China in a variety of ways about, climate change and other things, and, and not like being really like confrontational about the treatment of the Uyghurs or whatever. And so what Danny will say is, well, sure, I mean, but like we could separate out, like in this scenario, the left as in the left exercising state power, and the left as in left like civil society, and you could do and you could do the internationalist solidarity stuff through the latter, without doing it through the former. And like in a weird way, like some of the Putinist stuff you're talking about might be like a right-wing version of that, right? There's like Putinist aligned grassroots stuff that's engaged in solidarity with creepy right-wing parties in Europe, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's like it's all being directed out of the state.
Right, I would totally agree with that, and I think that's something that you have to kind of deal with. I mean, there is a sense in which, to quote Patrick Deneen, and to be careful, like Patrick Deneen is not a leftist friend. Let's be very clear about that.
Yeah,
but
Catholic integralist right winger.
Right. In that there is a way in which both the liberal order, both its left and its right, and we're going to use left and right here as relative terms oriented toward that form of liberalism, like the transatlantic post-war settlement. That's really fragile. And its fragility actually, in some ways, comes from its own engagement. I'll give you an example. Putin, for all of his fear of American aggression, did not really start actively opposing U.S. interventionism until Libya. Right. That was the turning point. He even kind of signed off on Libya, even though, he instantly regretted it. And it's interesting. You can read some rightish centrist realist will talk about this. Like, yeah, we screwed up there, and we tipped, and now it's very clear that it's not in the interest of these other powers to let the U.S. run roughshod on this. What I think is interesting, and I think a lot of American anti-imperialists kind of misunderstand this, is they interpret this as kind of like a Cold War, like the forces of anti-imperialism versus the forces of Western imperialism. And I think you need to take these people at their word that they see this as civilizational conflicts, and that they also think that basically the ideological views of the 20th century, the political modernity, is not only over, but that it's over from its own incoherence. Mm-hmm. And that these civilizational, they don't see themselves as ideological. All right. So that's another thing that you have to kind of deal with. These kind of civilizational notions of organic communities manifest in modern states, which like already I'm having to put all these caveats that are totally weirdly modern, even though, I thought it was interesting, for example, when Dugin brought up the Treaty of Westphalia and how it needs to be undone, but then is really tied to this idea of nation states and national characters. Because I'm like, yeah, but that's a result of the other. Like de Maistre starts, carving up the spiritual races of Germans and French people, but it's based off of linguistic differences off the Treaty of Westphalia and religious and confessional differences. It's not based off of any inherent civilizations in Europe that were cogent. All these. Yeah, it's another thing.
Even much later, right? You have. This there's a. I don't know. I'll just. This is not a deep cut. This is me remembering stuff from the Mike Duncan podcast, but in the French Revolution in the early stages when they still had the king, it was a really big deal to start referring to him as the king of the French, because you were saying that there was this national entity, the French, that he was the king of, rather than this just sort of being he's the king, and you're the army is the king's army, and he's fighting the king's wars, and all of this stuff that even in the late 1700s was still by far the dominant way of thinking about this stuff. You don't get really, I guess, you don't get to say, oh, I'm against all modernity, liberalism, fascism, socialism, whatever, it's all bad. But also, we got those, we got
the nation states, and we got Russia. You want to talk about his pre-Westphalian Russia, you're talking about to a little bit Ivan Bertuzzi, Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan the Awesome is also the word in Russian has a kind of dual meaning that's both bad but also good and overwhelming, kind of like awesome used to. Right. But really, the modern Russian state is a product of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great and the Westernizing forces. Because the weird thing about the Oprichniki and all that is that's a state within a state, actually formally, and it's like literally Ivan the Terrible like renounced his crown to take up his crown. I mean, it's a very strange to our modern conceptions, but it was to depower the actual like boyar system that really Russia was run under. And by Russia I mean the various principates, because they weren't a united country. Like Novgorod and Muscovy and all that were not really one country yet. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, that's interesting, and that's a. But honestly, if you want to fight Dugin, you need a historian. You don't need a philosopher, and you definitely don't need a philosopher who believes in like the international like rule of law and some vague notion of democracy that's not ever defined. You know, like I don't even, when I hate to say this, but when modern liberals say democracy, I don't even know what the hell they mean. Like, really, I don't, because most of their states are not particularly representative.
Well, I mean, and I think getting into what it would mean would be tricky. I mean, kind of in the way that Dugin was gesturing at a little bit in the debate when, you know, he said the stuff about, well, you know, by democracy, you actually don't mean majority rule. You know, you mean, you know, well, and I think there's this deliberate conflation on both ends of that of like protections of the rights of minorities in the sense that we might mean when we hear that phrase, and protections of the rights of economic elites to set the terms of
Madison's minority in the Federalist Paper was the rich explicitly. So like,
well, and which you know, I mean, I tend to be with like Samuel Boyd on this. If you look at the actual history of judicial review in the United States, and that's certainly the minority that's most consistently been protected. You know, like
exactly. Also, see what cops actually do. It's the minority that's most consistently been protected. But
no, exactly. Like it's not like you can have like sometimes courts. Sometimes courts invalidate laws in order to protect civil rights. Sometimes they invalidate civil rights laws. You know, that happens too, you know, but like the thing they've been pretty consistent about is the original mission. So yeah, right. There's that. But like, I think that if they actually got into like what people like Henri Lévy really means, it would get uncomfortable, because in a way, I mean, it's not really that, you know, I mean, there's obviously a big difference in practical terms, but in a way, it's not really that different from the underlying conception of like Putinist, like, you know, managed democracy in Russia. You know, it's good to have some democratic institutions as long as things are managed in such a way that you know it's never going to get out of hand.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think what's interesting also is. Dugin does clearly, I mean, despite all the talk about not having bridges, he actually clearly reads U.S. popular and academic political theory. One of the things is like he started picking up the multipolar world talk, I think around 2009 after the book I call it Fourth Positionism. It's Fourth Political Theory is the actual title of the book in English. Fourth Positionism is the political philosophy related to it. The multipolar world stuff is something he was able to seize on. He got that from Fareed Zakaria, from the best I can tell. Like, and he will occasionally actually explicitly reference Fareed Zakaria. And I remember that being a big talking point in America also around that time, the beginning of the Obama administration, at the end of the Bush administration. Everybody, you know, all these former centrist liberals were talking about, well, you know, how they were wrong and how there's a multipolar world and there will be no singular hegemon. And that is the language he uses with us. I don't know that he uses it with Russians so much. Maybe he does. I'm actually unclear on this. But the idea that the world is divided up into spheres, like, and that there are regional empires, and that's just natural to the world, is one. I mean, it's also a popular conception on parts of the American right. It's just the part of the American right that didn't really have a seat at the table until Trump. And to be fair, didn't even really have a seat at the table under Trump after they got rid of Bannon. For all of Bannon's nefariousness, Bannon did take paleoconservative relative isolationism, and calling it isolationism is a little bit of a misnomer, very seriously. And they do believe in like these regions of influence. Like, so they would argue, for example, and actually this is something that I would defend, say, Evo Morales saying, oh, he's not worried about Russian and Chinese imperialism because he's not really in their sphere of influence.
Yeah, right.
Whereas he, like Bolivia is in ours, under the Monroe Doctrine. And honestly,
which by the way, I would be consistent about this and say that I don't even slightly like. I don't blame anybody who's tried to withstand whatever empire they happen to be under the shadow of from taking a little, cynical short-term help from any other empire that like happens to to have its own reasons for extending that. And I'd say that whether we're talking about the Latin American leftist cases or Rojava or whatever, I think if you look at the history of successful national liberation movements for like the last 400 years, that's like invariably
how it works. Yeah, you have to play multiple major parties off of each other. Yeah. I mean, historically, from Ataturk to Nasser to the African liberation movements, that's how these things operate. And you have to this is where again I'm going to agree with Danny Bessner. You have to have like a realist foreign policy and a kind of ultimate goal that's separate from that. But you can't like totally let's say we get rid of the empire tomorrow,
right?
Like we'd still have to have let's say the DSA, God forbid, that took over the United States through totally peaceful elections and routed all the conservatives and put the Democrats in the minority and became overlords of this country overnight. It's not going to happen. But let's say it did. You'd still and you wanted to dismantle the empire. You would still have to have foreign policy. Now, I say this in the context, and people know that I believe this. I think most of our current nation states probably won't survive the next 100 years because of climate pressures making borders untenable. But, people think I'm a little bit crazy for that. But I mean, I think when you historically make comparisons, it's probably what's happening. Ironically, I think because of that, we're going to see more nationalism everywhere. It's kind of like you look at Georgia, you look at the South, right? The Republicans in the South are more crazy than Western Republicans. But ironically, they're actually a smaller minority in these areas than they are in like Utah. In Utah, for example, we have like a moderate Republican governor because the Republicans run everything. And like all politics is a debate between different groups of Republicans. Whereas like in Georgia, which has been, for demographic reasons, for age reasons, for a variety of reasons, barely been GOP for not very long. And conservatism, which is a legacy of the Dixiecrats there. I mean, you lived in Atlanta, the reason why they've gotten so much crazier is because they really aren't. They're trying to get everything they can done because they know that they probably aren't long for this world electorally there without some major, even more than they've already done, legal changes. The demographics are just not in their favor. And while those demographics, I actually don't believe demographics or destiny ideologies change with wealth changes and stuff. I do think that they know that. So that's why you're getting crazier and more aggressive laws. And similarly with the nationalists, nationalism is harder and harder to actually maintain in almost every way. I mean, it's kind of been given a little bit of a breather, and I use this term ironically, by COVID. But that's why it's going to be more virulent, more, and could actually win for a little while. I mean, if you look at the historical Marxist analysis of fascism, and I've always said if you took the Austro-Marxist stance, like taking the left opposition stance and the right opposition stance and put them together, you would actually have the truth. And that the fascism was not something that would have been sustainable, but it could have completely destroyed most of modern society in its manifestation, and almost did.
Right.
Like it definitely destroyed the European left. Like most of it was dead after World War II. So it's something that you really have to like. These things, just because they're declining, doesn't mean they're not super dangerous, right? But also, this liberalism that we're seeing is also declining, and it's losing. I mean, I think that's one thing that we can see. I mean, even now, if we look at like this manifestation in the Biden administration in America, how anemic does it look? Like just 7 months in. Like first it tried to make concessions to the left that it would have never historically made. Then it tried to make concessions to the right. Like it feels like it doesn't have anything left to stand on. It doesn't really have a base in the same way. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even seem like the bourgeoisie really care for it anymore. So it's an interesting problem, and I think we are going to have to like,
which actually does make it, I think, more shocking that the Biden administration, like, you know, whatever, like the one actually good and important thing that they did, that they actually stuck with it, like in the face of intense mainstream opposition, you know, which was getting out of Afghanistan, which
right.
Which actually did kind of shock me. Like I would have thought that I would have thought that Biden wouldn't have done that, or if he did do it, like the second like the media started demonizing him for it and like all of that, you know, they would have they did a little bit with the, you know, there was some drone murder on the way out the door, but like, you know, but they, like I would have thought that there would be like, okay, all right, we'll send some troops back. Sorry guys, you know, but they actually stuck with it, which is just not, you know, just generally in keeping with how they seem to operate.
Right. Well, it is interesting. I think part of that is because it is actually within their sphere of influence, like in a way that legislative politics only kind of is. But I also think if you look at Biden's record, Biden was a supporter of the invasion, but he also was apparently, and I've read multiple sources on this, he thought that Obama should have reversed his stance and pulled out by the end of the first term. So it's one of these things. It's not because he's not a warmonger, guys. It's because
but he might at least have he might actually be a smarter warmonger. Like he might actually have a sense that like these kinds of forever wars in the Middle East are so hopeless on their own terms that just even out of imperial self-interest at a certain point you have to cut your losses.
You got to Hadrian's Wall this, you got to Trajan this, right, to make your actual Roman imperial. I mean, an empire that constantly expands falls apart even faster. And you know, once an empire has reached its and I'm not even talking in modern, like we can get into modern imperial theory, which is different than what I'm talking about right now. I'm just making, you know, allusions to classical empire. But like, there's a real sense that like eventually you can't maintain everything. Your system gets too complex. You have too much of an apparatus to maintain, and it falls apart. And in a place like Afghanistan, it's not that Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires. It's not that nobody's ever taken it over. Like plenty of groups have. The Mongols, the Alexandrians, the Buddhist empires actually were established there. The Bactrians, for example, were a successor state that was there for a long time. But it's generally, when you look at the way most things go, it seems to be one of those points where you've expanded too far. What I find interesting about that is even from the standpoint of capital, the expansion doesn't make that much sense. Like how's the bourgeoisie in America benefiting from Afghanistan? Like that's one of the things that never made sense to me.
Yeah, right. I mean, defense contractors maybe, but it seems like there's got to be some other way to work that, you know, grift without actually having to keep the troops in Afghanistan. Well, bringing it back to the subject of the debate we were watching, I always think of one of the only worthwhile things I ever saw during the years that I watched Bill Maher, you know, on a regular basis, which was Ted Rall, who had been in Afghanistan. He wrote like a graphic novel about like covering Afghanistan. And he was like the sort of, I mean, anyway, I don't really know what his politics are now, but like at that point, he was sort of like the token Chomskyite, you know, in those who could go on Bill Maher and stuff. And he had this great story about, I think like late 2001, being in the back of a truck with a bunch of other foreign journalists, like he's American, but, people from various countries, covering the war, like a, U.S. military, truck going through like the bombed out countryside of Afghanistan. And so there's this Russian journalist who starts laughing, and he says, "Why are you laughing?" And he gestures expressively at the countryside and says, "Because all this is your problem now."
I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot to look at that. It's been interesting watching the U.S. left discuss this, because it also would sometimes get all weepy-eyed about the Soviet interference in Afghanistan, which was called for by a legitimately elected government. It was a fairly progressive government, but that government really didn't hold popularly.
Well,
it just held longer than ours. But
not to mention that's a little hard to justify on the basis of that, because the Soviet Union, pretty parallel in some ways to the early stages of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, like overthrew did a coup within that government, to get people, that it liked better as part of the operation where they're really pouring, Russian troops in, and like also seems like, I mean, I don't know. Granted, I'll grant in advance that this is like a weirdly conservative point for me to make, but I think it is true. Like, I think that the thing that I really got, like, I think that we could totally put aside the morality of invading Afghanistan. Not that there's nothing to say about that, and just say that, like, really what those 20 years proved is that the idea that the United States has the capacity to remake the society in the way that it wants it to is just wrong, right? I mean,
this seems to be true in almost every one of these states. I was laughing at, I lived through the reversal of the Arab Spring in Egypt, and I was laughing at Democracy Now's reporting on it. One of the things, I talked to Kuba W, who I can't say his last name because it's super Polish. And
Brzezinski,
yeah. I don't think that's correct, but I think it's pretty close. But we were talking about
I know I did it right once, but I may not have done it right since then.
Kuba Brzezinski, that it is more than a little bit ironic how these power plays work, because what they actually ended up doing in a lot of ways is hastening the end of U.S. geopolitical hegemony. They actually accelerated it. I mean, because, for example, not only were we encroaching on things close to Russia in ways that made Russia particularly uncomfortable, we kind of drove Russia and China into a block, which, by the way, historically speaking, they're not. Yes, they're closer together. Right. They have a porous border, but particularly after the fall of the USSR, I mean, and even going back to the secret speech, China and Russia have been at odds, and China has actually supported some weird stuff as a communist state to get at Russia, to get at the USSR, and to also get at Russia. And if you talk to the people who are familiar with Chinese-Russian issues now, there are points of tension. It's part of why BRICS was never coherent. The other thing is, like, they thought they could pull India into that sphere, and India clearly has its own agenda, also pretty reactionary from the standpoint. But there is a sense in which also China's more integrated into the Western world. Even though it's an ostensibly socialist country, that like its production system is crucial to the international global capitalist production system, even though it's used in a way to reduce like extreme poverty in China. I find this interesting because all these things play into people like Dugin's hands, because of the kind of hubris these liberals have on these foreign policy interventions. And it is really, we forget about this because of the kind of I think, cynical approximation of the anti-war movement in the 2000s, but that the Democrats are very much part of this liberal order.
Yeah, of course.
Right. I mean, but I think it's easy to forget that.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, that like structurally conservative point I was making there. I mean, I think the thing is, like, that also applies to the Soviet Union, right? Like the PDPA, don't get me wrong, clearly had way more of a popular base than the government the U.S. was propping up in Afghanistan. I don't, like, clearly, right? It lasted for years after the Soviets left, rather than like minutes, like the American one did. But even so, I mean, ultimately, what was going on there eventually was this attempt to use sort of overwhelming force to remake the rest of Afghanistan, in that image, largely, through the use of foreign force. And I just don't think, like, again, morality aside, I just don't think that would, I don't think that could have worked. Like, that's not like, that was, I think that was going to be futile, the same way that the U.S. attempt was going to be futile. I think that, that doesn't mean that, like, social progress is impossible in Afghanistan. I just don't think that can come about in that way.
No, I think it would have to be organic to I mean, I kind of do think that most societies do like, one of the things I found that Andrei Lévy didn't really talk about, because we didn't even talk about this, because he granted the invention of human of the human flourishings that we attach to international human rights law, specifically to Europe, which I was like, what? Like, okay, there are international rights even under, like, religious theocracies that apply even to non-member, like, particularly.
Yeah, well, and this is where, like, because his, like, Dugin says, oh yeah, human rights, whatever, that's some Western thing. Everybody else just thinks that, everybody else just thinks, and he proceeds to describe this, like, nightmare vision that's like what Ayn Rand people, straw man socialists, is thinking, that, like, oh, you are to your society like the leg is to a body, you don't have any rights. And it's like, that's what the rest of us think. This is just some weird Western European and American thing. And instead of challenging that and saying, no, for God's sake, right? Like, you can find, like, you can find things in every cultural tradition, that have some kind of expression of some of these values that we're talking about. We talk about human rights. Instead of doing that, which would have actually been made for an interesting debate, Henri Lévy did this weird thing where he was like, yeah, well, every culture has good things. And
you guys invented anti-totalitarianism and we invented human rights. Have a nice day. And I was like, what? I mean, and I do actually, like, I have a complicated relationship with the idea of human rights. I will actually admit that, because its traditional justification is in natural law. Natural law doesn't hold. Logically, if you try to justify human rights under utilitarian frameworks, it totally falls apart. Like, it's not a thing. But one thing I will say is that another interesting thing is both of them that's why the correct position is Rawlsianism with G.A. Cohen characteristics. But anyway, that's we'll put that. Yeah, that's another debate. That's a me and you debate. I'm a good proletarian virtuist. But one thing I will say on this, in a serious sense, is that I got derailed by that. There is a way in which individualism and collectivism are not the values of any society. Like, like the idea, like, having spent times in quote highly collectivist societies, years of my life in East Asia and in North Africa, that people don't have conceptions of individuality, of individual responsibility. In fact, like the whole Confucian ethic that is the undergirding thing that people are going to bring up when it comes to East Asia is very much based on individual responsibility and individual flourishing under a collective whole. In a way, it's actually this almost Hegelian point where you can't have an individual without a collective and vice versa. Like neither one of those things are meaningful by themselves. Like even kind of conceptually, like the idea that you would be an individual is based off of differentiating yourself from a collective, but also needing that collective for the things that you would get the education and stuff to develop your sense of self in the first place. Like the whole thing is based on a fundamental like caricature of the way humans interact and develop, and it's just posited like we're individualists, no, we're collectivists, and I'm like, no. I was going to say no one actually believes that horse shit, but apparently you do. And honestly, if you're arguing that the collectivist argument looks a little better right now, because if when you see the way this individualism gets manifested, it's clearly hypocritical in all cases. Like it's not it's not human. Individual rights is very selectively applied. You don't get individual rights from being drone struck in Afghanistan.
Right.
Yeah,
right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, again, like I just it would have been really good to see Dugin debate somebody who didn't just like share all of his assumptions about the world, but in this like weird, naive, but actually the West is amazing way. But like basically like, yeah, no, the West invented human rights, and this is there is this like basically a lot of this. It just seemed like like Henri Lévy was who Dugin would have conjured up as the made up foil for him to argue against, like the guy at the bring it back to the Plato's dialogues, the guy to who's there to say stupid shit for Socrates to correct, like that. It's like, oh, but actually isn't the United States amazing, and doesn't it enforce this rule-based international order with human rights? Well, not so, you see, maybe the Fukuyama one is better. I did find that, by the way. I sent that to you in the private chat, but and maybe in a month or so can come back.
Yeah, maybe we can come back and do a better one. I mean, one thing I will say is you're going to hear a lot of the idea that a lot of people have because they're cultural relativist, that human rights are an invention of the West. And I will say that the framework of human rights as they are understood as human rights, yes, they totally are. The idea that those ideas that contend that are unique to Western society and that other societies are collectivist, frankly, as a person who's lived in many different societies and has communicated with many different people, the collectivist individualist debate is a horseshit debate. It's not real.
Right.
It's a modernist debate that comes out of ideas around the Enlightenment, which is actually interesting. That Dugin is one of his selective, like anti-modernity, modernity. The collectivism versus individualism debate is a modern debate. Mm-hmm. You don't hear it articulated in pre-modern societies. Like it just doesn't come up. But the idea that individuals did not have any rights, or actually what they would have been afforded, and phrase that, it's not rights but dignities.
Yeah, well, and again, I think that I'd separate out the issue of cultural relativism, and actually that is in itself really interesting. We didn't talk that much about it. That like how Dugin, as like the the reactionary is still is actually embracing all of the stuff that Western conservatives like typically accuse like leftists and progressives of thinking.
Right.
That he's just frankly culturally relativist about morality. He believes in some sort of weird postmodern relativism about truth, even. Like whatever he was saying about epistemology, there at the end, which is what Jordan Peterson thinks that Marxists think. And so there's this moral relativism, there's cultural relativism about morality. But then there's also just like, so, whatever your culture says is right for your culture, cultures can't be wrong. But then there's just weird, like ultra particularism about what people are like, because, I think that, again, I would go back to Against the Web, or or you could look at like Amartya Sen, who's the main inspiration for that part of the last chapter. You could find people, like, cultures are big, capacious things where lots of people say lots of different things.
Well, I mean, you won't find a coherent definition of culture probably in this world. I mean, and I am a defender of actually looking at and understanding culture, but I haven't found two anthropologists who define it the same way even.
Yeah.
Like,
and people in every cultural tradition, I mean, you are going to find some people who find their way to approximately the values that we're gesturing at when we use the phrase human rights, and and express it in the language of that culture. I mean, we could have, we could talk about why the sort of frameworks that we're talking about specifically largely did originate, in the West. Although I think that's a, I guess, I think that's going to be a much more fruitful discussion if you think it has something to do with what was going on in the material world, and it's not just like, this. It's not just, it's not just a quite, a theory of history where people, for some reason, people just happen to have ideas in different places that influences other people, and that's what causes institutions to be born. Which, to be fair, was both of their theory of history. I mean, both Dugin and Henri Lévy, like, basically seem to think that just for some for some reason that's not really specified. In Dugin's case, Russians are all collectivists, and Westerners are all individualists. And when Henri Lévy was attacking him by talking about all of these fascist philosophers that Dugin liked, he seemed to be saying that, like, the Nazis happened because of Heidegger and Carl Schmitt, like that's why that the Third Reich, like, arose out of the minds of those thinkers, rather than, like, being something that happened in the world that, like, those that people like Heidegger and Schmitt are, like, maybe justifying, but that's that's still, both of them still seem to be assuming that that subjective ideas are the primary determinant of what happens. Anyway,
yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about this is how many people take the kind of cultural, ideological, or mythic narrative about self-conception very seriously. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is, for example, this idea of the collective culture of the Soviet Union. And while the Soviet Union was not always a respecter of individual rights, to say that it wasn't part of its self-conception is actually false, explicitly.
Right.
They did see individual rights as not being fully manifestable until certain things were done. And that all rights would be formal and thus bourgeois. But the idea that you only had a collective identity in the Soviet Union, that's not true. It's also not true. I mean, I think it's interesting because the people also say that Americans are very individualistic. And I would say, yeah, they tell themselves that. I find it remarkable how predictable Americans are culturally. And how much abject conformity there is, particularly in the people who say the most that they are, individualist. In fact, I mean, the irony has been pointed out even by conservative friends of mine that the individualists are usually dire conformists in their daily lives, and that the people who talk about collective identities tend to be actually pretty individualistic. I also found this true in other cultures. And the idea that these cultures are completely separated in capitalist modernity is, like, kind of laughable. Russia is not able to wall itself off, and even China cannot wall itself off. It just tries to control how it engages with the world. So it's, and in some ways it's more successful at it. And I think we have to also abandon these ways of talking about things, or we're ceding stuff to these reactionaries, because not every reactionary you're going to find is going to be a rabid individualist who believes in some kind of rugged frontier individualism that was never true even there. Like,
no, well, sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, like a lot of reactionaries. Patrick. You mentioned Patrick Deneen earlier, and like I don't know. I mean, like weirdly enough, I debated Charlie Kirk last Friday. He there's some weird pop Denenianism, even that's even filtered down into into there. Which goes along with how all of these guys have suddenly decided that they're populists. I think lots of American conservatives are sort of letting go of the like pseudo libertarian way of framing conservatism and are casting about for something else, which does sometimes look like not like Dugin. That's the most extreme extreme version of it, but is somewhere along that spectrum. But we could keep going to this vein.
Yeah, we could totally go this whole night, so we should probably wrap it up. I would ask you one question though.
Yeah, go for it.
How does it feel when you engage with these kind of conservatives versus when you engage with American ones? Because I kind of find that I can't, like, if I have to listen to Charlie fucking Kirk, I want to bash my head against the wall. Whereas I do think Dugin is an actual interesting enemy.
Yeah, right. Sure.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. Right. I mean, if I think that, I mean, there's definitely a spectrum, and Dugin is on the opposite end of the spectrum. I mean, like we just watched the debate where Dugin, it's like, I mean, all of his beliefs suck, but I mean, like, but you could tell that he's actually spent a lot of time thinking about, how they fit together, and what he thinks about everything else.
And he knows what his enemies think for the most part too, actually, which is something you can't say for Henri Lévy, or honestly even a lot of leftists, frankly. Like, they don't really understand their opposition, and sometimes I think they don't want to, which to me, and also indicates they don't really want to win.
I mean, obviously, I agree with that. I mean, I think that if anything, actually, well, I don't know which is worse, because like a lot of times now, the American, like reactionaries, like Kirk or like James Lindsay, or all of those people, or whatever. Our old friend Jordan Peterson, like those people have like weird conspiracy theories about what leftists believe. But in a weird way, they're trying, like that's, it's all about like Hegel and Herbert Marcuse and whatever, and it's bizarre, like how they think this works, but like at least they're thinking about it. Whereas I'm disconcerted by how often people who agree with me about politics have as their singular explanation for like all other perspectives that that everybody else must just be like cynically grifted, that if you have that, like they're like this sounds like I'm exaggerating, but like I don't know. I mean, like I talk to a lot, like especially the online left, maybe like it just seems like a lot of people really do believe that that like everybody in the world secretly has like socialist beliefs. And but some people are just like taking money to like pretend not to.
Yeah, QAnon isn't the only people who's walled off and forgotten that other people really don't agree with them in the world. But I mean, I do think, for example, there's a lot of people who have this mythic working class, and I say this as a person who explicitly comes out of the working class, that they think just are just all secret socialists somehow, and I'm like. No, they're not. They're probably not conservatives either, but they're not that either. You're going to have to do more work to convince them of the value of what we do. And I think we also, like, the reason why I bring it up is I sometimes think American leftists get dull because we fight really dull enemies. Like that Peterson was intellectually impressive over here was just shows how sad the state of it. Like
how low the bar is. Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And yeah, I mean, I don't think most people, most working class people, or in other words, most people, like I don't think most people are, are conservatives. But I mean, I think more than anything, like I think that. I think that most people's sincere beliefs are just like a little messy and incoherent. Like that's
right.
That's
Me too. They're vaguely political and not really, right? There's not a coherence to them.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I just wanted to talk to you about it because it's interesting because I know you've been focusing on Charlie Kirk and oh my God, that American Marxism book, which even the arch reactionary Paul Godfrey was like, this book is shit. Like I was just really laughing because I was like, oh, the conservative intellectuals are even mad at it for being embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, it literally says Franklin School. So there you go.
You can't get your conspiracy theories right.
Yeah. No, I fun fact. I actually still haven't forced myself to finish that book yet, but I initially tried to listen to the audiobook, like I figured I could just like get through it while I took the dog on walks and stuff. And the audiobook is read by Mark Levin. So it's like, oh wow, this is just gonna be hours and hours of being screamed at. Like I can't do this. I've gotta actually read the print book. It's just gonna be too painful to try to take in that way, and reading it isn't fun either, but it's still better than listening to it, which is why I mean, I just thought it was funny. Yeah, when I posted that, I mean, that was just because like it was just funny that those two things happened back to back, that like the Kirk debate, and then it's like, okay, fuck, I have to finish reading this thing, which it's like, man, I want to. All right, next. Can I do Yoram Hazoni or somebody next? Because like this is, like this would be so much better,
I'd be interested in watching you take on Patrick Deneen. But anyway,
yeah. Well, maybe someday. But yeah, that would be much better. And it's always like a little bit of there are competing imperatives here too, because of the one.
You got to entertain people, and then yeah.
Well, you got to entertain people, but then. Sure, but then there's also like even on like a more like a different level, like okay, the kinds of conservatives that we've just been talking about are like way less impressive than not only your Deneen's and Hazonis, whatever, but also like. Honestly, like, God love him, like at least the sort of like libertarians who are obsessed with the non-aggression principle or whatever, like I will give them credit for having thought through their beliefs like way better, than these kind of
even reason. I actually kind of was thinking the other day, like I miss arguing with Reason Mag people because at least you understood what the debate framing was. Like like and some of these people, I don't even know what we're arguing, like. No. I don't know that you believe anything.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But the flip side of that is that, like, and part of the reason that I did the Kirk debate, like when the townspeople people suggested it, like initially I was like, yeah, I don't know. But when I thought about it more, part of the reason I did it is like, well, okay, look, I could do the debate with the hardcore libertarian where, I trot out like the Matt Brunig argument about why, like, the non-aggression stuff is circular. And I'm, the joke I made about this several times, like, I'm sure I'll still be doing that. Like when I'm like in my 90s and I'm being wheeled out onto the stage and I can barely get it together to remember why it's circular. But like, unfortunately, since we live in a fallen world, your Levins and your Kirks represent a much more popular current of right wing thought. So, like at some point, I think probably like even politically, like should engage with that, because like for every one of the non-aggression principle people, there are like 10,000 people who kind of vaguely agree with the kinds of stuff that Kirk is saying.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually agree with that. It's one of the things with arguing with these intellectual conservatives is you aren't getting the kind of populist zeitgeist. It's like if I only argued with highly academic Marxist or left communists, and I don't ever like come in and talk to DSAers, then I actually have no idea what the average person who even identifies as a socialist, which is not the average person, by the way, like it would think, like, because I'm in such a rarefied world.
Exactly. Now that said, I totally do the Deneen thing, and honestly, at this point, I really want to just as kind of a, like
palate cleanser, like you can't argue with like Ben Shapiro all the time. Like, right.
Exactly.
But yeah, so thank you for having me on, and I'd be interested in doing this again. And
let's do. I was serious. Let's do like in a month or something. Let's do the let's do the Fukuyama one. To be interested.
In about a year, maybe we should also do the Hitchens versus Hitchens debate when your book comes out.
Well, it's gonna be a lot sooner than that, but yeah,
I should keep up with our publishing schedule better. For your publisher.
Well, I think exact date yet to be determined, but I actually did convince them for once. I very much lost this argument last time, which is why the last book contains like these references that were incredibly dated by the time it came out. But this, like what the Trump administration might do. But for this one, I actually did convince, or convince Doug to convince
the powers that be,
the powers that be to accelerate the schedule. So if it doesn't come out quite in time for the 10-year anniversary of Hitchens' passing, it can at least be not that long after that. So
that makes you the scholar of Christopher and me the scholar of Peter. So
that's good. I like I find Peter really interesting. Like I talked about it just a little bit in the book, but it's he is like I thought. I tried. I didn't get through the Cameron delusion, formerly, the one that was the Broken Compass. But I did read all of Rage Against God, and that was actually like an interesting book, just as a sort of window into like the it's just as kind of like a window into the soul of this like extremely earnest, extremely reactionary, Christian. So anyway, we should
extremely reactionary, but vaguely socialistic at points, and then really not at others. So it's
well, I mean, it's weird, right? So, and I think also like in that, you're talking about, well, actually, which Hitchens versus Hitchens debate are you talking about? Grand Rapids or Conway Hall?
Either one, but I remember I liked the Conway Hall one. I thought it was very illustrative of both of them.
So we actually already did the Grand Rapids one, but let's do Conway Hall. That'd be fun. So but like the Grand Rapids one, which is actually super weird to rewatch because or to watch all the way through, because the clip of Hitchens's opening statement from the God half, or Christopher Hitchens, sorry, I should say, opening statement from the God half of the Grand Rapids debate, like, I remember seeing that on YouTube, not that many years after that debate would have happened, and thinking, that's really good, like this is like a really eloquent statement of this kind of humanistic critique of Christian, like moral critique of Christianity, basically. And then it was really disconcerting to watch it and realize that how the other half of the debate was spent with him defending the Iraq War.
Right.
That makes me feel so gross for liking the other half.
I mean, that was a weird debate where I was like, if you split their positions and added them together, you might have a decent human. No,
exactly. And then and the thing about the Iraq half of that debate is that's like, okay, obviously Peter Hitchens is very far from being like a left internationalist, and like some of the reasons that he gives for his position on Iraq are like, right-wing reasons, as you'd expect, but like also the way he explains it, you do get this sense that on a visceral human level, like, he actually did find his way to this entirely correct reaction to watching the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think, that'd be fun. Also, because I think Peter's in that, he's interesting because he's one of these intellectual conservatives who can still talk like a populist one. Whereas, some of these people like when Dugin tries to go on Alex Jones, it doesn't work because because he actually makes himself look like an idiot, and he's not at all. He's just catering to Alex's audience, and I think as a point to end off on, I think that made a lot of Americans not take him seriously. And while I don't want to like pump up his laurels, or pretend that he's something that he's not, I do think as a nationalist conservative who has a thought out worldview, even if I don't actually find it particularly coherent or true, he's a much better articulator of it than he's presented as when he is presented at all in the American media. In the American media, he's just presented as like Rasputin or something, like he's the evil mastermind behind Putin's whatever. And that's not what he is at all. He is much more of a figure like a Peter Hitchens or even more like a Deneen in our context than he is, an Alex Jones. But that's the only place that's going to give him the time of day here. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Europe, he can get people like ostensibly as serious as Henri Lévy on the air, but as Bernard-Henri Lévy. But I'll end it there.
All right, sounds good. So should check out the Varn vlog on YouTube. Good stuff there. I very, I honestly don't listen to very much that my friends produce, in podcasts and YouTube, because if I did, I'd do nothing else. I understand. But every now and again, I do tune into that, and it's always interesting. So people should check that out, and we will leave it there for tonight.